Welcome back, dreamers, to Sleepory, your nightly retreat into history's strangely soothing, slightly smelly corners. If you're here, it means you've dimmed the lights, turned on that fan for a cozy background hum, and you're ready to slip quietly into a world far from emails, deadlines, and the eternal mystery of missing socks. Here, we trade stress for a story, and tonight, you're going to meet a boy who became a knight, but not the shiny, dramatic kind who saves princesses while his hair stays perfect. No, we're diving into the quiet, blistered hands, bug-bitten dreams kind of knighthood, the real deal. Before we begin, if you enjoy these soft, sleepy journeys through history's back alleys, give this video a like, share it with someone whose insomnia needs a medieval cure, and subscribe to Sleepory. It helps us craft more strange, heartfelt bedtime adventures for you. Also, comment below and let me know where you are listening from tonight. What time is it for you? I read every single one, and it's like mapping our tiny global campfire. Now, breathe in and out. Gently let the day fade. You are safe here. Once upon a time, not in a castle, not in a battlefield, but in a crooked cottage at the edge of a wild whispering wood, a boy named Elric was waking up to a day that would change absolutely nothing, and yet somehow, everything. His house was warmed by stone and smoke, which always clings to your clothes, but smells a little like comfort. He wasn't rich, it wasn't royal, just a boy with calloused hands, a loud stomach, and a head full of daydreams involving horses, swords, and dramatically heroic poses in front of chickens. His father was a cooper, a barrel maker, which sounds romantic until you try lifting one. Elric did try and drop the mallet, nearly flattened a goose. His father laughed and said, "You'll be strong enough someday, just not today." That sentence, it never left him. It lived quietly in his bones, even when everything else, the cottage, the goose, his father, faded. Elric didn't dream of glory. Not yet. He dreamed of riding far beyond the orchard, wearing something shiny that didn't smell like a goat. He kept smooth stones in a pouch and pretended they were gold for his imaginary warhorse. He gave speeches to the chickens, bold declarations of honor and destiny, which they ignored rudely. He rescued sticks from puddles, declaring them lost swords. And one day, just as the sun was hanging low and everything smelled like damp moss and soup, a real knight passed through. Not a polished storybook knight, but one with dust in the cracks of his armor and dents that looked like they'd been earned. He said nothing. I stayed only one night, but he looked at Elric just once, and that look, that was the spark, and that spark, oh, it was just getting started. Elric couldn't sleep after that night. Not because the straw mattress was crawling again, though, yes, it was, but because something had shifted. The look that the night gave him wasn't warm, it wasn't even kind, but it was real, solid, like a sword slammed into the dirt and left standing. That 1 second, one shared breath between a mud-splattered boy and a weary soldier, had cracked something open in Elric's chest, and now he couldn't unfeel it. The night left before sunrise. No farewells, no trumpet sounds, no mystic quests offered, just dust in the air and hoofprints that Elric swore he'd never let wash away. From that morning on, something changed. He didn't tell anyone. What was there to say? A tired stranger looked at me, and now I feel like the moon is vibrating under my feet. Instead, Elric did what determined dreamers have done since the dawn of time. He trained in secret, like a slightly underfed superhero with no costume, no mentor, and a stick for a sword. He began each day before the rooster crowed, before the mist lifted, before his mother started humming. He'd slip out the creaky door with a bread crust, march past the orchard where the crows argued about ownership, and climb the hill behind it. There, where the grass grew thick and wild, he ran. Not because it was fun, it wasn't. It burned. It itched. It made his lungs feel like someone had installed fireplaces inside them. But he ran anyway. He fashioned a wooden sword from a broken fence post and a dream. It splintered constantly. It gave him more splinters than victories. But it felt right in his hand, like maybe, just maybe, it was meant to be held. He'd swing it until his arms ached, then swing it again. To build strength, he filled water buckets until they sloshed and made his shoulders scream, then walked laps around the cottage. His mother thought he was possessed. His father just raised an eyebrow and handed him another bucket. Then came the older man. Every village has one, the local relic that smells like onions and stories. Elric found his outside the mill, drunk, slumped against a barrel like he'd been born there. Everyone ignored him, assuming he was part of the background noise of forgotten wars and fermented mistakes. But Elric listened. The man had once been a soldier, a footman, not noble, not famous. But he'd survived more than most. And one day, between hiccups and curses, he started talking about foot placement, about balance, about where to aim if your sword is dull and the enemy's more intelligent than you. Elric soaked it all up. He began standing differently, moving more quietly, and practicing alone until the moon came up and the owls blinked at him like confused librarians. He wasn't good. Not yet. But he was trying. And in a world that expected him to stay small and silent, trying was already rebellion. His mother noticed his coat was ripped more often. She asked questions. He said it was the cold. She didn't believe him. Still, she stitched padding into the lining without comment, a quiet kind of love that didn't ask for explanations. That coat became his armor long before he ever touched metal. Years passed like that, quiet, relentless, breathless. Then came the day. 14 and full of fire, Elric didn't leave a note. He packed bread, tied on his patched boots, and left before dawn. He walked for hours, 23 miles of mud, stones, and bleeding heels. He passed fields, cottages, and one very startled badger. And when the castle appeared in the distance, rising like a promise forged in stone, he didn't cry. I didn't hesitate. He marched to the gate, cheeks sunburnt, eyes fierce, and said, "I want to become a page." The guard laughed. Of course, he did. Elric was small, scraped up, wearing a coat that smelled like moss and desperation. But the guard stopped laughing when he looked into Elric's eyes. Something there. Not rage, not ego, just refusal. A refusal to back down, to be ordinary. And that's how he got in. Not because he was chosen, not because he was special, but because he wouldn't leave. The work was awful, unheroic. He cleaned chamber pots and polished armor until his fingers blistered. He swept so much ash that he started dreaming in gray. He learned to speak only when spoken to and learned how to stand for hours without shifting. But he also learned to watch. He watched how knights rested one hand on their hips, how squires oiled leather in circles, not lines, how the quietest man in the room was always the deadliest. Elric noticed everything. I noticed and remembered. He slept in a crowded room with 5 others. He missed his mother's bread. Missed the creaking of the front door. I missed the owl by the orchard, and that always sounded judgmental. But one morning he was told to report to the practice yard. There, lined up with other boys, he was handed a sword. Not wood, not pretend. Real, cold, honest. He wrapped his hands around the hilt, and something in his chest snapped into place. Not loudly, not dramatically. It's just a quiet, internal shift, like the gears of a watch finally clicking after years of winding. The sword was heavier than he expected. It bit into his palms and made his arms tremble. But he didn't drop it. He adjusted his grip and swung again. That's when Sir Alden noticed him. Not a grand man, not famous. But when he walked into the yard, even the wind seemed to pause. He didn't shout. I didn't praise. I just observed, corrected, and moved like smoke wrapped in the discipline. When Elric overextended, Sir Alden said, "Waste of motion." When he stumbled, Alden murmured, "Fall in battle once, you'll remember." And the first time Elric landed a clean strike, months into training, Alden said, "Good," just that, one word. But it echoed louder than any cheer, and in that moment Elric knew. This was it. Not glory, not legend, but work. Grit. Quiet, unshakable purpose. He wasn't a knight yet, but he'd stopped pretending. He was on the path now. And that path, muddy and painful and lined with calluses, it was his. It wasn't long before the practice yard became Elric's entire world. The gray stones of the courtyard, worn smooth by generations of footsteps, seemed to whisper secrets to him. Every morning before sunrise, while other squires still wrestled with dreams, Elric was already out there, swinging, sweating, slipping, and getting back up, and always getting back up. Because if there was one lesson that the sword in his hand had taught him, it was this. You don't stop when you're tired. You stop when you're done. And in Elric's mind, he wasn't even close. Sir Alden rarely spoke, but his silence was louder than most men's shouting. When Elric's strikes were wild, Alden would merely raise an eyebrow. When his stance faltered, he'd nod toward the ground, a silent reminder that the earth doesn't forgive imbalance. But when Elric's blade found its mark, clean, sharp, and accurate, Sir Alden's expression would soften almost imperceptibly, not quite pride, but something like belief. That was all Elric needed. His world narrowed into a rhythm. Wake, train, eat, work, train again. Sometimes he forgot entire days. Pain blurred everything. His arms trembled from endless drills. His legs felt like hollow logs filled with bricks. Blisters came and went like the phases of the moon. He once lost a toenail and didn't even notice until dinner. And yet, he was happy. Not the loud kind of happiness, not the dancing, singing, shouting kind, no. Elric was content in a way that planted roots. He didn't need applause. I didn't want glory. He wanted clarity, the sharp focus of knowing he was moving forward, one cut, one bruise, one early morning at a time. Then came the day that changed everything. A visiting noblewoman arrived at the castle. No one knew her name. She wore a cloak of heavy velvet and a pendant of pale blue stone that shimmered like ice. Her hair was silver gray, but her eyes were young, sharp, dangerous. She stood silently at the yard's edge, watching the squire's train. Elric didn't notice her at first. He was too busy dodging a blow from a larger opponent, a boy named Brannick, who was built like a door and just as subtle. Elric parried, slipped. He regained his footing. He moved with purpose, not grace, a study of stubborn effort rather than elegance. And then, mid-swing, he caught sight of her. She was watching him, directly. She didn't blink. When the bout ended, she murmured something to the steward, pointed at Elric, and said 2 words, "That one." No explanation, no smile, just the choice. The next day, Elric was summoned, not to the great hall, not to a ceremony, to the stables. There, waiting in the morning fog, were 3 older squires, all broad-shouldered, armored, seasoned. They barely glanced at him. A caravan mission, the steward explained. Guard duty. Not glamorous, not heroic, but real. They rode in silence. Rain soaked through their cloaks, turning everything to damp misery. They slept in barns, shared cold bread, and fought off a pair of starving thieves with sticks and fury. Elric's hands blistered from the reins. His legs ached from long rides. But he didn't complain. It didn't falter. He learned how to patch torn leather with frozen fingers, reef how to keep watch without drifting, how to look confident even when he had no idea what he was doing. At the journey's end, the merchant looked at him, tired, soaked, and silent, and said, "You didn't run." That sentence hit harder than any blow in the yard. It meant something. He returned to the castle changed, not taller, not tougher, just still. It was like something inside him had stopped searching and started settling. He moved with the patience of someone who had seen real fear and kept pushing anyway. And then came the battlefield. He was 16, not yet a knight, not even close. He was there as a runner, a water carrier, a reins holder, but he was there, among the noise, among the blood, among the chaos that no storybook ever quite captured. The air reeked of steel and sweat, but also something older, something deeper, memory maybe, or fear dressed in 1,000 voices. Men screamed, horses reared, arrows fell like deadly rain. Elric didn't fight that day, not with a sword, but he fought to carry messages across mud-slicked fields. He fought to keep the wounded breathing and not to vomit when he saw a boy younger than him bleed out in the grass. He held the reins of a warhorse while Sir Alden mounted, calm as ever, red-cloaked, silent. Elric watched his mentor ride into the fray without hesitation, without a word, a force of stillness in the storm. At one point, Elric carried a wounded man, groaning, bleeding, scared, back to the healer's tent. The man clutched Elric's arm, eyes wild, and whispered, "Did I do something worth remembering?" Elric didn't hesitate. He lied. Yes, the man died before nightfall. Later, Elric sat beneath a twisted tree. He'd washed his hands 4 times, but they still felt stained. His sword, untouched, lay across his lap like a silent accusation. He wondered, truly, deeply, if this was what he was meant for, not the fight, the aftermath. Sir Alden found him there. I didn't speak for a long while, just sat. Then, finally, he said, "A sword is the last thing a knight should be known for." Elric didn't understand it yet, not fully, but the words burrowed into his heart like seeds. He would carry them forever, and they would grow into something more substantial than steel. Because that day, something broke, and something better started to build in its place. Elric didn't ride back from the battlefield with triumph in his chest. There were no parades, songs, or stolen glances from castle maids. What he carried home instead was silence, heavy, slow, and full of things he couldn't quite name. He was 16, yes, but he felt older. Not wiser, not braver, just worn. His still untouched sword remained at his side like a question he hadn't yet answered. Each time he looked at it, he remembered the boy with the thigh wound. I remembered how the blood soaked through Elric's coat. He remembered the way his voice cracked when he lied, told that dying stranger his life meant something. And maybe it had. Perhaps all lives did. But Elric didn't feel noble. He felt like a sponge that had soaked up too much grief and couldn't wring it out. Sir Alden didn't speak of the battle afterward. Not a word. Not about the wounds, the losses, the dead. He only watched Elric with those unreadable eyes and nodded. Once, when their gazes met, it wasn't approved, it wasn't dismissal. It was something in between, a silent acknowledgement that Elric had crossed a threshold and there was no going back. A month later, he was given a horse. Not a gift, exactly. It's more like a statement, a responsibility. She was nothing like the war horses he'd seen on the field. Her coat was patchy and gray in places that suggested age. One ear had been chewed, by a dog, maybe, or another horse, and her left eye twitched when she was irritated, which, to be fair, was often. But her name was Mora, and the first time Elric laid a hand on her flank, she flinched, then snorted like he'd offended her ancestry. They didn't bond immediately. The first ride was chaos. Mora veered left, refused to trot, stopped whenever she saw a bird, and once tried to bite Elric's boot just for fun. Grooms laughed. One even suggested the horse was cursed. But Elric didn't pull harder. I didn't yell. He spoke softly, waited longer, learned her rhythms. Within a week, they moved as one. Mora never galloped unless she wanted to. Elric respected that. She wasn't a tool. She wasn't glory on four legs. She was his first faithful companion as a knight in training, not because she obeyed, but because she chose to. He brushed her himself every night. They refused to let pages do it, not out of pride, but of principle. She was his partner. You don't delegate loyalty. Some knights mocked him for it. They called it peasant behavior. But others noticed, quietly. They started tending their horses, too, less out of duty and more out of something they couldn't quite explain. One day, Elric was called to stand before the castle's lord. No explanation, just a summons. His heart thumped, not out of fear, but from something colder, that familiar chill of unknown expectations. The hall was large, echoing with the soft clink of armor and the hush of distant voices. The lord sat high on his dais, robes heavy with embroidery, eyes sharper than any blade. He studied Elric like he was a scroll waiting to be translated. "Name," he asked. "Elric, son of Jaren," came the reply. "Clear. Even. And what do you want?" The question surprised him. No one ever asked squires what they wanted. He could have said knighthood. I could have said honor. I could have said land, a title, glory in battle. Instead, he said, "To serve." The lord frowned. "Not to rise?" Elric shook his head. "If the rising does not serve, it is not rising." Behind the dais, someone scribbled his name onto a parchment. Someone else smiled. He didn't know what it meant. I didn't ask. Later, Sir Alden told him quietly, "It means you'll be remembered." And suddenly Elric thought of everything. The stones he once pretended were gold coins, the puddle swords, the chickens who never applauded his speeches. His father's laughter when he dropped the mallet, his mother's bread was wrapped in cloth, the oak tree he'd swung a stick under until his arms gave out. Let memory be enough, he whispered to himself that night. Not glory, not legend, just memory. As the months passed, Elric found himself drawn to the younger pages, the ones who tripped over their feet, held swords like spoons, and stared at the world with wide, overwhelmed eyes. No one told him to help them. No one expected it, but he remembered what it felt like to be overlooked, dismissed. He showed them how to hold a blade and, more importantly, how to breathe. How to read a face before reacting, how to listen before striking. One evening, under the fading orange sky, a boy no older than 10 asked him, "What's the hardest part?" Elric thought for a long time, then said, "Coming home." The boy didn't understand. That was fine, he would one day. And in that moment, with his hand on the boy's shoulder, Elric didn't feel like a warrior. He felt like a tree that knew it might not bloom again, but would still offer shade for someone else. Then came winter. Elric was 17. The patrol was routine, or so they were told. 3 knights, 2 squires, and 1 frozen path through the forest. They were ambushed. Elric didn't see the blade, only felt it. A sharp burst of cold across his shoulder, then heat, then nothing at all. His vision blurred, narrowed, and expanded. He didn't remember how he kept fighting. He didn't stop. Not for victory, for the others. When it was over, he collapsed. He woke days later, bandaged, breath shallow in the infirmary. Sir Alden was beside Ambush. He didn't speak of bravery or survival, only said, "You didn't leave anyone behind." Elric drifted back into sleep. When he woke again, someone had left a cloth beside his bed, folded neatly. Inside, a note. Just 4 words. "You are still here. He never found out who wrote it. I never needed to." That cloth became his banner, not one that flew on poles, but one he carried in his satchel, worn and silent. A reminder that being alive wasn't just luck. It was a choice, a commitment, a kind of knighthood all its own. And spring returned, as it always did, but this time it came with a summons. Not for training, not for battle, but for knighthood. Not because of one great act, but because of many small ones, because Elric had not run, because he listened, because he held power softly like it was something breakable. And maybe it was. Elric didn't ride back from the battlefield with triumph in his chest. There were no parades, songs, or stolen glances from castlemaids. What he carried home instead was silence, heavy, slow, and full of things he couldn't quite name. He was 16, yes, but he felt older. Not wiser, not braver, just worn. His still untouched sword remained at his side like a question he hadn't yet answered. Each time he looked at it, he remembered the boy with the thigh wound. I remembered how the blood soaked through Elric's coat. He remembered the way his voice cracked when he lied, told that dying stranger his life meant something. And maybe it had. Perhaps all lives did. But Elric didn't feel noble. He felt like a sponge that had soaked up too much grief and couldn't wring it out. Sir Alden didn't speak of the battle afterward. Not a word. Not about the wounds, the losses, the dead. He only watched Elric with those unreadable eyes and nodded. Once, when their gazes met, it wasn't approved, it wasn't dismissal, it was something in between, a silent acknowledgement that Elric had crossed a threshold and there was no going back. A month later, he was given a horse. Not a gift, exactly. It's more like a statement, a responsibility. She was nothing like the war horses he'd seen on the field. Her coat was patchy and gray in places that suggested age. One ear had been chewed, by a dog maybe, or another horse. And her left eye twitched when she was irritated, which, to be fair, was often. But her name was Mora, and the first time Elric laid a hand on her flank, she flinched, then snorted like he'd offended her ancestry. They didn't bond immediately. The first ride was chaos. Mora veered left, refused to trot, stopped whenever she saw a bird, and once tried to bite Elric's boot just for fun. Grooms laughed. One even suggested the horse was cursed, but Elric didn't pull harder. I didn't yell. He spoke softly, waited longer, learned her rhythms. Within a week, they moved as one. Mora never galloped unless she wanted to. Elric respected that. She wasn't a tool. She wasn't glory on 4 legs. She was his first faithful companion as a knight in training. Not because she obeyed, because she chose to. He brushed her himself every night. They refused to let pages do it, not out of pride but of principle. She was his partner. You don't delegate loyalty. Some knights mocked him for it. They called it peasant behavior. But others noticed. Quietly. They started tending their horses too. Less out of duty and more out of something they couldn't quite explain. One day, Elric was called to stand before the castle's lord. No explanation, just a summons. His heart thumped, not out of fear, but from something colder, that familiar chill of unknown expectations. The hall was large, echoing with the soft clink of armor and the hush of distant voices. The lord sat high on his dais, robes heavy with embroidery, eyes sharper than any blade. He studied Elric like he was a scroll waiting to be translated. "Name?" he asked. "Elric, son of Jaren," came the reply. Clear. Even. "And what do you want?" The question surprised him. No one ever asked squires what they wanted. He could have said knighthood, I could have said honor, I could have said land, a title, glory in battle. Instead, he said to serve. The lord frowned. "Not to rise?" Elric shook his head. "If the rising does not serve, it is not rising." Behind the dais, someone scribbled his name onto a parchment. Someone else smiled. He didn't know what it meant. I didn't ask. Later, Sir Alden told him quietly, "It means you'll be remembered." And suddenly, Elric thought of everything. The stones he once pretended were gold coins, the puddle swords, the chickens who never applauded his speeches, his father's laughter when he dropped the mallet. His mother's bread was wrapped in cloth, the oak tree he'd swung a stick under until his arms gave out. Let memory be enough, he whispered to himself that night. Not glory, not legend, just memory. As the months passed, Elric found himself drawn to the younger pages, the ones who tripped over their feet, held swords like spoons, and stared at the world with wide, overwhelmed eyes. No one told him to help them. No one expected it, but he remembered what it felt like to be overlooked, dismissed. He showed them how to hold a blade and, more importantly, how to breathe, how to read a face before reacting, how to listen before striking. One evening, under the fading orange sky, a boy no older than 10 asked him, "What's the hardest part?" Elric thought for a long time, then said, "Coming home." The boy didn't understand. That was fine. He would one day. And in that moment, with his hand on the boy's shoulder, Elric didn't feel like a warrior. He felt like a tree that knew it might not bloom again but would still offer shade for someone else. Then came winter. Elric was 17. The patrol was routine, or so they were told. 3 nights, 2 squires, and 1 frozen path through the forest. They were ambushed. Elric didn't see the blade, only felt it. A sharp burst of cold across his shoulder, then heat, then nothing at all. His vision blurred, narrowed, and expanded. He didn't remember how he kept fighting. He didn't stop. Not for victory, for the others. When it was over, he collapsed. He woke days later, bandaged, breath shallow, in the infirmary. Sir Alden was beside him. He didn't mention the ambush. They didn't speak of bravery or survival, only said, "You didn't leave anyone behind." Elric drifted back into sleep. When he woke again, someone had left a cloth beside his bed, folded neatly. Inside a note. Just 4 words. "You are still here." He never found out who wrote it. I never needed to. That cloth became his banner, not one that flew on poles, but one he carried in his satchel, worn and silent. A reminder that being alive wasn't just luck, it was a choice, a commitment, a kind of knighthood all its own. And spring returned, as it always did. But this time it came with a summons, not for training, not for battle, but for knighthood. Not because of one great act, but because of many small ones, because Elric had not run, because he listened, because he held power softly like it was something breakable. And maybe it was. Elric never set out to become a legend. That was never the goal. He didn't chase banners or ballads. He didn't polish his armor to shine beneath torchlight. He didn't sit in courts hoping to impress nobles who couldn't lift a sword if their lives depended on it. He quietly rode from village to village like a shadow dressed in wool and leather. Sometimes the only way people knew he had come was that things had stopped breaking. Fences stood upright, the well was cleaner, and the silence of fear had lifted just enough to let laughter peek through. But over time, his name began to travel without him. Not loudly, not grandly. Whispers at first. A merchant in one town swore he'd seen the knight who fixed his cart axle. A child remembered the tall man who patched her shoes with a piece of his cloak. A baker's wife told her cousin about the stranger who lifted her husband's body from a collapsed stable and wept with her until sunrise. Sir Elric, the knight with the soft hands and the tired eyes. The one who asked for no reward left before the thanks could catch up to him. And with every whisper, the legend grew. But Elric didn't feel like a legend. He still felt like the boy in the orchard, swinging a stick at ghosts and dreaming of steel. He still remembered the first time he held a real sword, the weight of it, the cold, the promise, and he still carried that cloth, folded, worn, whispering, "You are still here." Even when the road was long, his bones ached like the joints of old gates, even when the nights were too quiet and the memories too loud. There was one village, high in the hills, where he stayed longer than usual. Bandits had struck them, and not just raided, shattered. Houses burned, elders beaten, and crops destroyed for no reason beyond cruelty. It wasn't just damage, it was devastation. Elric rode in late one evening as the sun spilled its last gold across the stone walls. The villagers barely looked at him. They were done hoping and done believing that someone might care. But he didn't ask for their belief. He just got to work. He mended roofs with raw hands. He trained the children to defend themselves with sticks, not to fight, but to stand tall. He replaced a door using salvaged wood and one rusty hinge. When food ran low, he hunted quietly, sharing without fanfare. When someone cried, he sat beside them. When someone raged, he gave them space. When someone doubted, he didn't argue, he just stayed. And one day a girl, maybe 12, maybe younger, tugged at his sleeve. She looked at him with wide, uncertain eyes and asked, "Are you a knight?" He crouched to her height. I thought for a moment, then said, "Only if I do things worth being one." She nodded. He thought harder than he had, then smiled. It was enough. The bandits returned 3 nights later. They thought the village was still weak. They were wrong. Elric stood in the center of the square, not with a squadron or a horn, but alone. He didn't shout, he didn't threaten, he waited. When the first bandit charged, he moved precisely, born not from anger, but from clarity. The fight didn't last long. The emboldened villagers joined him, not to kill, but to defend. By morning, it was over. The bandits were gone, no one died. And that, Elric would say later, was the real victory. He stayed 1 more week, just to be sure. Then he packed his things, cloak, sword, and cloth, and prepared to leave. But before he could mount Mora, the village elder approached. She was bent with age, wrapped in shawls that smelled of smoke and thyme. In her hand was a small pouch. "For your journey," she said. Elric shook his head. "I didn't do this for pay." "I know," she smiled, "but open it anyway." He did. Inside was not gold, but something far rarer, a carved wooden figure. It looked like him, crudely made, cloak blowing in the wind, a sword slung across the back. But the figure wasn't standing tall. It was kneeling, hands resting on its thighs, eyes lowered. "It's not a statue of a hero," the elder said. "It's a reminder that humility can be stronger than armor." He swallowed the lump in his throat. I took the figure gently. "I'll keep it safe," he promised. And he did. Always. Years passed. The world kept turning. Elric grew older, though no one noticed at first. His steps were still firm. His grip was still steady. But his eyes carried more weight, and his silences grew longer. He'd been to more places than he could name. He stopped more violence than he could recall. He had buried friends, held the hands of strangers as they took their last breath, whispered words of comfort he wasn't always sure he believed. But he never stopped writing. He never stopped showing up. Until one night, in a quiet village tucked against the edge of a dark wood, a storm rolled in. The sky cracked. The winds howled. And Elric, now older than most of the fathers in the village, stood watch outside a small cottage where a family huddled with their newborn. The roof was weak. The walls are thin. So he stood there, sword drawn, not to fight, but to shield. The storm passed. Dawn broke. And when the family stepped outside, Elric was still standing, soaked, silent, still here. They offered him food, a place to rest. He smiled, nodded, and accepted a seat by the fire. And later that night, when he reached into his bag, he found the cloth again, frayed now, barely legible. But those 4 words still held. "You are still here." He whispered them aloud, just once, then leaned back. And for the first time in decades, he allowed himself to sleep deeply. Not as a knight, not as a legend, just like Elric, a man who had chosen to stay. Elric awoke to the sound of rain, not the storm-born kind that breaks roofs and rattles windows, but the soft, steady tapping that fills silence like a lullaby for the land. The fire had died sometime before dawn, but the embers still glowed faintly, casting long shadows against the cottage wall. He blinked slowly, unsure of where he was, until the scent of wet earth and wool returned him. He was in the village near the dark woods, the one with the cracked chimney, the barefoot children, the father who stuttered when nervous but carved like a master, and the newborn who cried like she already knew the weight of the world. And for once, Elric hadn't left by sunrise. He stretched, felt the ache in his shoulder, an old wound from a time he barely remembered anymore, and stepped outside. The air was clean, cold, and refreshing. The rain fell through gaps in the thatch, slid down leaves, and vanished into the soil. Mora stood under the awning, shaking her mane as if to say, "You finally slept, old man." He gave her a nod. It had been months since he stayed in one place for over a week, maybe years. He wasn't keeping track anymore, not because he didn't care, but because time had softened at the edges. Days bled into nights, villages into names, names into memories. But this place, it felt different. Maybe because of the storm. Maybe because the newborn had gripped his finger like she meant it. Or maybe Elric admitted silently because he was tired in a way he hadn't been before. Not the kind of tiredness that sleeps fixed, the type that settled in your bones. The kind that whispered, "It's time." But what did time mean for someone like him? He had never built a home and never claimed land. Never chased love, not in the way poets sang about. His life had been roads and rain and small fires built with strangers. His legacy? 1,000 villages that didn't remember his face, well, only that something once came through and left hope behind. And yet, as he watched the rain fall in silver threads across the garden, he felt something pull at him. Not duty, not danger. Possibility. He spent the day helping repair the roof. The timid and wide-eyed father offered him a hammer with shaking hands, as if afraid to insult him by assuming he knew how to use it. Elric only smiled, took the tool, and climbed the ladder. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence was comfortable enough. A reminder that safety didn't always arrive on horseback or with shining armor. Sometimes it just holds a nail steady. That evening, the villagers gathered around a low fire near the square. Someone brought bread, someone else offered cider. A child tried to juggle 3 apples and hit himself in the face. There was laughter, the kind that heals. Elric sat quietly, sipping slowly, and watched it unfold. No one asked him for stories. No one begged him to stay, but they made space for him. They didn't treat him like a hero, they treated him like a neighbor. It rattled him more than he cared to admit. He was used to leaving, used to be the ghost that passed through, fixing, mending, defending, and disappearing before the soil remembered his footprints. But here, no one seemed in a rush to let him vanish. And so the next morning, when he was expected to leave, he didn't. He stayed. He helped patch the south fence, sharpened tools, took the older boys into the woods and taught them how to track quietly, listen to wind patterns, and notice the bent grass where a rabbit had been. Not for hunting, for awareness. At night, he taught the younger ones how to fall without fear. "How do you fall without getting hurt?" one asked, wide-eyed. "You don't," Elric replied. "But you learn how to get back up faster." They didn't understand. Not yet, but one day they would. Each evening, he returned to the same small cottage. The family gave him the back room, which wasn't much more than a pile of blankets and a cracked window. But it was warm, it was kind, and for the first time in decades, he didn't fall asleep with one hand on the hilt of his sword. Weeks passed like that. He lost count after the first frost, and then came the traveler, a boy, barely 20, drenched from the road, eyes hollow, armor far too new and clean. He found Elric by the well, approached slowly, and bowed too deep. "Sir Elric?" he asked. Elric didn't answer, not right away. "My master sent me," the boy continued. "They say you're the one who—" He trailed off, looking around the village as if expecting something grander. Elric gestured for him to sit. The boy did. Turns out war was stirring again. Not in this land, but close. Too close. A noble house had fallen. Another was rising, fists clenched, blood fresh. Knights were being summoned, old names pulled from old scrolls, and Elric's name was on one of them. He listened, he nodded, and then when the boy finished, Elric said, "No." The boy blinked. "Sir?" "I'm not leaving," Elric said calmly, "but you're needed. I'm needed here." The boy didn't argue. He stared, confused, as the story he believed had just fallen apart. "You're not what I expected," the boy said. Elric smiled. "Good." The boy left the next morning, alone, and Elric stayed. He stayed through the winter, through the thaw, through the planting and the harvest. His hair grew longer, his beard went gray, the children grew taller, the cottages are stronger, and somewhere along the way, Elric stopped being the knight who stayed and became Elric. Just Elric. In the spring, the newborn he'd once guarded took her first steps across the square, arms flailing, eyes bright. She fell. Cried. He picked her up. "There it is," he whispered. "Now get back up." She did, and in that moment, Elric knew. He didn't have to keep riding. He didn't have to keep proving he was still here. Because now, he truly was. Elric awoke to the sound of rain. Not the storm-born kind that breaks roofs and rattles windows, but the soft, steady tapping that fills silence like a lullaby for the land. The fire had died sometime before dawn, but the embers still glowed faintly, casting long shadows against the cottage wall. He blinked slowly, unsure of where he was, until the scent of wet earth and wool returned him. He was in the village near the dark woods. The one with the cracked chimney, the barefoot children, the father who stuttered when nervous but carved like a master, and the newborn who cried like she already knew the weight of the world. And for once, Elric hadn't left by sunrise. He stretched, felt the ache in his shoulder, an old wound from a time he barely remembered anymore, and stepped outside. The air was clean, cold, and refreshing. The rain fell through gaps in the thatch, slid down leaves, and vanished into the soil. Mora stood under the awning, shaking her mane as if to say, "You finally slept, old man." He gave her a nod. It had been months since he stayed in one place for over a week, maybe years. He wasn't keeping track anymore, not because he didn't care, but because time had softened edges. Days bled into nights, villages into names, names into memories. But this place, it felt different. Maybe because of the storm. Maybe because the newborn had gripped his finger like she meant it. Or maybe Elric admitted silently because he was tired in a way he hadn't been before. Not the kind of tiredness that sleeps fixed. The type that settled in your bones. The kind that whispered, "It's time." But what did time mean for someone like him? He had never built a home and never claimed land. Never chased love, not in the way poets sang about. His life had been roads and rain and small fires built with strangers. His legacy? 1,000 villages that didn't remember his face, only that something once came through and left hope behind. And yet, as he watched the rain fall in silver threads across the garden, he felt something pull at him. Not duty, not danger, possibility. He spent the day helping repair the roof. The timid and wide-eyed father offered him a hammer with shaking hands as if afraid to insult him by assuming he knew how to use it. Elric only smiled, took the tool, and climbed the ladder. He didn't speak much. He didn't need to. His presence was comfortable enough, a reminder that safety didn't always arrive on horseback or with shining armor. Sometimes it just holds a nail steady. That evening, the villagers gathered around a low fire near the square. Someone brought bread. Someone else offered cider. A child tried to juggle 3 apples and hit himself in the face. There was laughter, the kind that heals. Elric sat quietly, sipping slowly, and watched it unfold. No one asked him for stories. No one begged him to stay. But they made space for him. They didn't treat him like a hero. They treated him like a neighbor. It rattled him more than he cared to admit. He was used to leaving. Used to be the ghost that passed through, fixing, mending, defending, and disappearing before the soil remembered his footprints. But here, no one seemed in a rush to let him vanish. And so the next morning when he was expected to leave, he didn't. He stayed. He helped patch the south fence, sharpened tools, took the older boys into the woods and taught them how to track quietly, listen to wind patterns, and notice the bent grass where a rabbit had been. Not for hunting, for awareness. At night, he taught the younger ones how to fall without fear. "How do you fall without getting hurt?" one asked, wide-eyed. "You don't," Elric replied, "but you learn how to get back up faster." They didn't understand. Not yet, but one day they would. Each evening, he returned to the same small cottage. The family gave him the back room, which wasn't much more than a pile of blankets and a cracked window. But it was warm. It was kind. And for the first time in decades, he didn't fall asleep with one hand on the hilt of his sword. Weeks passed like that. He lost count after the first frost, and then came the traveler. A boy, barely 20, drenched from the road, eyes hollow, armor far too new and clean. He found Elric by the well, approached slowly, and bowed too deep. "Sir Elric?" he asked. Elric didn't answer, not right away. "My master sent me," the boy continued. "They say you're the one who..." He trailed off, looking around the village as if expecting something grander. Elric gestured for him to sit. The boy did. Turns out war was stirring again. Not in this land, but close. Too close. A noble house had fallen. Another was rising, fists clenched, blood fresh. Knights were being summoned, old names pulled from old scrolls, and Elric's name was on one of them. He listened. He nodded. And then when the boy finished, Elric said, "No." The boy blinked. "I, sir?" "I'm not leaving," Elric said calmly, "but you're needed." "I'm needed here." The boy didn't argue. He stared, confused, as the story he believed had just fallen apart. "You're not what I expected," the boy said. Elric smiled. "Good." The boy left the next morning, alone. And Elric stayed. He stayed through the winter, through the thaw, through the planting and the harvest. His hair grew longer, his beard went gray, the children grew taller, the cottages are stronger. And somewhere along the way, Elric stopped being the knight who stayed and became Elric, just Elric. In the spring, the newborn he'd once guarded took her first steps across the square, arms flailing, eyes bright. She fell, cried. He picked her up. "There it is," he whispered. "Now get back up." She did. And in that moment, Elric knew. He didn't have to keep riding. He didn't have to keep proving he was still here. because now he truly was. It had been 2 seasons since the raid. The fields were green again, full of stubborn sprouts and cautious hope. The houses, patched and rebuilt, stood firmer than before. Even the well, once cracked and forgotten, now offered water as clean and cold as any river. Children played in the streets without looking over their shoulders. The laughter returned, not in sudden bursts, but in steady trickles, like a creek learning to flow again. And Elric? He stayed. He didn't wear armor anymore. Not even the light chain he used to sleep with wrapped around his ribs like a promise. These days, he wore linen and leather, faded by sun and soil, and his hands were more often wrapped around tools than hilts. He helped with the planting, learned how to prune trees, and even built a bench outside the schoolhouse for the older villagers to rest their knees. He smiled more, he spoke more, and though the ache in his right shoulder still flared every time rain rolled in, he no longer winced when he stood. Pain, like memory, had become part of him, something he carried, not something that took him. But peace is a tricky thing. It's soft, subtle, and sometimes it makes you forget that the world beyond your fence still burns. The messenger came on horseback, dust-covered, wide-eyed, trembling. He didn't ask for food or rest. He only asked for Elric. "Please," the boy said. "They said you live here." Elric stood in the square, hammer in one hand, straw tangled in his hair. He looked at the boy, nodded once, and listened. A border town 3 days' ride north had been taken. Not by raiders, not by bandits, but by soldiers. Real ones. Organized. Ruthless. They weren't there to steal, they were there to claim. Expansion, the messenger said. Forced loyalty, burned homes, executions. A quiet war moving like smoke. "They're calling for knights," the boy whispered. "Real ones." Elric didn't answer. He watched the boy ride off back into the dust. That night, he sat by the fire with the elder and the schoolmaster, hands wrapped around a chipped mug of cider, Mora snoring gently outside the cottage window. "You'll go," the elder said, not unkindly. "Won't you?" "I haven't decided," Elric replied. But that was a lie. He already had. At dawn, he packed his things. Not many, just what fit in a small satchel, his old sword, a whetstone, dried meat, a vial of herbs, and, carefully folded, the cloth. Faded now. The stitching is loose, but the words still held. "You are still here." The village gathered quietly. They didn't protest. I didn't cry. They knew him too well for that. The girl he once carried through a storm, now walking, talking, full of sass, offered him a flower she picked from the schoolyard fence. "For luck," she said. He tucked it behind his ear and smiled, then mounted Mora and rode, 3 days, through valleys that smelled of ash, through forests where the birds didn't sing, through towns that stared too long and said too little. When he arrived, the border town wasn't a town anymore. It was a warning. Burned-out buildings, roads choked with smoke, survivors who looked like shadows trying to pretend they still had weight. And soldiers. Real ones, not in armor, but in numbers, in discipline. Their banners snapped in the wind as they owned it. Elric didn't announce himself. He found the resistance, small, angry, disorganized, and offered what he could. Strategy, silence, patience. He taught them not just how to strike, but when to wait. Not how to fight like warriors, but how to last like roots. It wasn't enough. The soldiers came at night. Hard, fast, too many. Elric fought like the wind, never in one place too long. He moved between the alleys, between the screams, between the dying. He held the line until the line was no longer a line, but a memory. And when the town finally fell, he was gone. Some say he died that night. Others say they saw him ride west, face bloodied, eyes clear, carrying a child wrapped in soot and blankets. But the truth is stranger. Weeks later, a boy arrived in a village far from the front lines, barefoot, hungry, clutching a folded piece of cloth. He said a man gave it to him. A knight, maybe, or a ghost, hard to say. But he told the boy to run, to live, to remember. The villagers unfolded the cloth, 4 words, "You are still here," and just below it in shaky script, one more, "Keep going." They hung it in the square. And in the following seasons, travelers came, not looking for Elric, but asking about the place that stood when others fell, asking about the knight who never stayed long, but always left something behind. And so his story lived, not in songs, not in scrolls, but in walls rebuilt, in hands held, in the firelight that never went out. Because some knights don't wear crowns, they carry shovels, and some legends aren't shouted, they whispered, still here, still needed, still choosing to stand. The seasons turned. not because anyone willed them to, but because they always do. Summer bled into a rust-colored autumn, and autumn surrendered to winter with a sigh. Snow came late that year, reluctant as if the sky wasn't quite ready to forget the fire that had come before it. But the air still chilled, the soil hardened, and the roads again turned quiet. Children built a small monument in a town along the old river road. It wasn't made of marble. It didn't sparkle. It was just a pile of stones, carefully stacked at the edge of a field, with a wooden post rising from the center. On it, someone had nailed a piece of cloth. Frayed. Stained. Familiar. You are still here. Passersby would stop, confused at first, then curious. Some left offerings, bread, flowers, tokens from places Elric had likely never seen, others left in silence. Heads bowed, hearts strangely heavier. No one knew exactly where he was now. Some claimed he'd been seen in the mountains, helping a shepherd fend off wolves. Others whispered about a healer deep in the forest who said a man with tired eyes had taught her how to stitch wounds cleaner and faster, but no one could say for sure. And that was the point. Elric was no longer a man tied to one place or name. He had become something else entirely. An idea passed from mouth to mouth, warm like a blanket, quiet like a vow. He was the knight who didn't wear a crest, the protector who didn't ask to be followed, the shadow that stood in the gap when others fled. In a way, he had become the message he carried, not just the bearer of "you are still here," but the proof of it. Still, even legends grow weary, and somewhere in the hills, on a ridge that overlooked a valley untouched by war, Elric found a cabin. It wasn't grand. It leaned slightly to the left and creaked in the wind, but it had a roof that held, a fire that didn't smoke too much, and a view that made you forget the rest of the world. He built a fence around it, not to keep anyone out, but to give himself something to mend. For the first time in years, he didn't travel by dawn. He didn't answer distant cries or follow rumors. He stayed. And in that stay, he remembered how to rest. He planted a garden, mostly herbs, though the carrots had promise. He chopped wood and learned the rhythms of wind and bark. He listened to birds, not for warning, but for wonder. And when he couldn't sleep, he'd walk outside, barefoot, letting the cold earth remind him that he was, in fact, still alive, still here. One morning, a knock came at the door. Not loud, just steady. Elric opened it to find a girl, older than the ones he used to train, but not by much. Her cloak was too thin and her boots were worn, but her eyes, sharp, focused, like she'd traveled far and wasn't turning back. "Are you him?" she asked. He didn't answer. "Not yet. I found the cloth," she said, "the one with the words. It made me want to find out who wrote them." Elric stepped aside and gestured for her to enter. She sat by the fire, fingers trembling slightly as she warmed them. "I want to learn," she said. "Not how to fight, not just that. I want to know how to stay." That word, he felt it in his chest like a bell rung deep and low. Stay. She stayed the winter, and when the snow melted, others came. Not many. It's just a trickle. A baker's son who had lost his parents, a former squire turned deserter, heavy with regret, a healer with shaky hands who wanted to steady them. They came not for glory, but for grounding. They didn't call it training. They just called it learning. And Elric, quietly, patiently, became their teacher. He taught them how to listen to silence, how to mend more than break, how to hold a blade like a whisper, not a threat, how to survive not because they were stronger, but because they were still standing. No pledges, no uniforms, no war cries, just people learning how to be better people. Sometimes late at night, Elric would sit by the fire, cloth in hand, tracing the letters with a calloused finger. "You are still here." And now, so were they. One spring, word came from the capital, a new king, a call for knights. Titles offered, lands promised. Last, they even sent a messenger to the cabin, cloaked in velvet, scroll in hand. He read the decree aloud with great pomp, then paused. "Sir Elric," he said, "you're summoned." Elric looked at him, then at the cloth, then back. "No," he said. The messenger blinked. "No? I've already answered my summons," Elric said, and he closed the door. Behind him, the students continued their work, one sharpening tools, another drawing maps of the surrounding terrain, and a third tending to Morath, now gray around the eyes, still ornery as ever. The legend of Elric wouldn't end with a crown or a sword ceremony. It would end with a garden, with laughter from a new generation, with hands that built more than they destroyed. Because the knight who had once wandered, once fought, once bled for names he couldn't remember, had finally done the most radical thing of all. He stayed. And that, above all else, was enough. Time in the hills moved slower, not lazily, not wastefully, just deliberately. Like the land had learned the value of patience, mornings came with dew on the grass and the low groan of Mora stretching her old limbs. Evenings came with birdsong, firelight, and stories passed between hands calloused from honest work. The days were simple, meaning they were full of quiet growth, silent lessons, and small victories no one wrote down. Elric had grown older. It was in the way he grunted when bending to lift a log, in the fine silver lines creeping into his beard, in the way he sat more often and listened longer. But it wasn't a fading. It was a settling, like a sword finally sheathed, not because the battle was over, but because something more important had begun. The cabin, once just a shelter, had become a home. And the ones who came to it, not just to visit, but to stay, became something closer to family. Not bound by blood or banner, but by choice. They built together, learned together, failed often, and laughed about it even more often. The girl who had found the cloth, her name was Lysa. She had once flinched at every loud sound. Now, she led the morning drills, correcting footwork with a sharp voice but never cruel. The former squire, Milo, had become the heart of the garden. He talked to the soil like it was an old friend and somehow always knew when the beans needed water. And Elric, he watched them, not with the pride of a commander, but with the softness of someone who had once needed to save himself. One evening, as the fire popped and the wind carried the scent of pine through the windows, Lysa approached him with a scroll in hand. "A message," she said, "from the capital." Elric didn't reach for it. Lysa hesitated. "They're asking again." He nodded. "Of course they are. They say it's peaceful now, that it's rebuilding. Sanoa, that they want you to help guide it." Another nod. "Sounds like they need leaders." "You are one." Elric smiled, not dismissively, but gently. "No, Lysa, I'm a teacher. I'm a reminder. That's not the same thing." She looked down, frustrated, not with him, but with the world that kept asking more of the one man who had already given enough. "What should I tell them?" she asked. He paused, looked at the fire, then at her. "Tell them I've already built a kingdom," he said. "It just doesn't look the way they expect." Lysa nodded, and for the first time she understood. Because what Elric had built wasn't walls or towers. It was resilience. It was care. It was the strength that didn't break things but held them gently. Still, life in the hills wasn't without hardship. One winter, a sickness swept through. Not violent, not fast, just stubborn. It took energy first, then appetite, then days themselves. Lysa collapsed in the garden. Milo couldn't stand without coughing. Others grew pale and weak. Elric, older now, fought to keep them warm, fed, and safe. He gathered herbs, brewed remedies, and read old notes from a healer who had once stayed with them for a season. He moved slower than he wanted, his joints screaming protest, his breath sometimes short. But he didn't stop. When Lysa's fever broke, she found him asleep on the floor beside her cot, a pot of untouched tea still warm nearby. "You stayed?" she whispered. He opened one eye. "Of course I did." "You're not strong enough for this." "Then it's a good thing strength isn't the only thing that matters." The sickness passed. They recovered. And from then on, Lysa insisted on taking over the spring chores. Milo built a second bench by the stream. The others started writing down Elric's lessons, not because he asked them to, but because they realized one day, quietly, that he wouldn't always be able to say them himself. One morning, Elric didn't come down from the loft. Not unusual. He liked to sleep more now. But by midday, Lysa climbed the ladder. He was awake, sitting upright and holding the cloth in his hands. "You are still here," he murmured, running his fingers over the letters like he had 1,000 times. "Yes," she said. "And so are you," he smiled, "for now." That evening, he asked them to gather. They sat on the floor, on stools, on windowsills. Every face is familiar, every silence earned. "I don't know how many more seasons I have," he began, "and that's not a sad thing. Don't make it one." Nobody spoke. "I stayed when I could have run. I listened when I could have shouted. I chose this, and it's been enough. More than enough." He looked at each of them. "You're ready." They shook their heads, but he only smiled again. "No one ever feels ready. Not really, but that doesn't mean you aren't." Then he handed Lysa the cloth. Her fingers shook as she took it. "You carry it now," he said. "And not just the words." She nodded. and as the firelight flickered in her eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen since the orchard. Not a warrior or soldier, but a spark. The same spark once lit up a boy swinging a stick at the sky. That night, the stars hung a little lower, the wind was a little warmer, and Elric, the knight who never needed a crown, the man who chose to stay, finally slept with both hands resting peacefully at his sides. Elric did not die that night, but something shifted. He no longer rose at dawn to start the fire. He no longer led the drills, no longer walked the perimeter with Mora, who now spent most days grazing in the lower meadow, her coat grayer, her movements slower. Elric still spoke, still smiled, still carved bits of wood into small animals for the children, but he did these things from the bench, wrapped in his old cloak, the one patched in a dozen places and heavy with memory. He was fading, yes, but he wasn't gone, and in the gentle, unwavering way that only those who truly love can manage, the others filled the space he left behind, not to replace him, but to honor him. Lysa carried the cloth now, but she also carried the voice. She took over the lessons, not with the authority of a commander, but with the quiet, precise strength of someone who had watched carefully and listened deeply. She didn't try to become Elric. She tried to be worthy of him. And Milo, who once could barely look a blade without flinching, now helped shape them. He had begun forging simple tools in the shed behind the garden. But after Elric's quiet blessing one chilly afternoon, he began forging something more. Not weapons, he said. Instruments. And they were. Blades that could harvest as well as defend, tools that could build and protect. It was the same steel, the same fire, but used differently now, used wisely. The hilltop cabin became something more than shelter again. Travelers came not in search of a hero, but of learning. Not in search of safety, but of understanding. They came tired, bruised, lost. Some came with swords, others came with nothing but questions, and they stayed. Because even as Elric grew quieter, the place he had built continued to speak. One spring, a boy arrived, no more than 13, silent, eyes like glass after rain. He didn't speak for 3 days. Not a word. Then, on the 4th morning, he pointed at Elric and asked, was he the one who fought the Fire Knights? No one corrected him, because in a way, he had. The stories had changed. Of course they had. That's what stories do. Elric in them had faced dragons, kings, armies. He had single-handedly held back a siege. He had walked into a burning castle and carried out 10 children on his back. None of it was true, and all of it was. Because what mattered wasn't the fire or the castle. It was that Elric had stayed, had chosen to stay, had chosen to make something better instead of running from what was broken. The boy stayed, too, and he smiled again. That spring, Lysa planted a new tree just outside the main cabin. It's for him, she said as the others watched. For now or forever? Milo asked. She didn't answer. Didn't need to, because the tree would grow either way. And Elric watched it from his bench, eyes soft, hands folded. He didn't speak much anymore, but when he did, the words carried weight. One evening, as the fire crackled low and the stars blinked into existence one by one, he called Lysa over. She sat beside him, waited. You know, he said, voice barely more than gravel and wind, I used to think legacy was a sword, she smiled. You were half right, he chuckled, coughed, then turned serious again. It's not what you leave behind, he said. It's what you pass on while you're still here, she nodded. Promise me something, he said. Anything. Don't be me, she blinked. What? Be better. She didn't argue, just reached into her pouch, unfolded the cloth. The edges were nearly gone now, but the words, still stitched, still present, remained. You are still here. I am, she said. He closed his eyes. And in that moment, everything was enough. That summer, Elric stopped leaving the cabin entirely. He stayed inside, near the window, where he could hear the laughter, the hammering, the rhythm of a life that had grown beyond him. Sometimes the children would come read to him, old stories, poems, or the lessons Lysa had written down from his teachings. He never corrected them. He just listened. Listened to the voices that would carry his into a future he would never see. And then one morning, the world was quiet. The fire had burned low. The air was still. Elric sat in his chair, hands resting on the cloth, eyes closed, breath gone. No struggle, no final words. Just peace. The kind that only comes when you've emptied yourself into something greater. They didn't bury him right away. They kept him there for one more day, letting people come, letting stories be told. Not the loud ones, the real ones. The ones about mended roofs, patched boots, held hands, the ones about someone who stayed. Then at dawn, they buried him beneath the tree, not with stone or sword, but with a small wooden carving of a horse and a folded piece of cloth placed in his hand. Later, Milo added a plaque, just wood, simple. It read, Sir Elric, Knight of Stillness, Builder of Roots, Keeper of Fire. And below, just 4 familiar words, You are still here. And he was. In the tree, in the tools, in the laughter echoing across the hills. He was in every choice to protect rather than destroy, in every hand offered instead of a fist. In every person who chose to stay when leaving would have been easier. Elric was gone, but everything he had taught, that would never leave. Years passed. The hill changed, as hills do. The tree outside the cabin grew tall, its trunk thick with memory, its branches bending gently in the wind like they knew what had once stood beneath them. Birds nested there, children climbed there, and every spring white blossoms spilled across its limbs like soft reminders of the man who had once watched over it all. Elric was gone, but the world had not moved on. It had grown around him. The cabin had become more than a home. It was now a school, a refuge, a place of beginning. People came not to mourn, but to learn, and those who had once been students, Lysa, Milo, the boy with the quiet eyes, were now the keepers, the builders, the protectors of the path Elric had paved with sweat, silence, and unshakable compassion. They didn't call themselves knights. They didn't wear crests or colors, but they carried something heavier, the weight of purpose. Lysa led with grace, not with speeches or commands, but with example. She still wore her training cloak, though it was patched and faded, more memory than garment now. When new travelers arrived, wounded, lost, uncertain, she greeted them with calm eyes and a question Elric had once asked her. What do you need? Not who are you? Not what can you offer? But what do you need? And in that, the work began. Milo had built a forge, a real one this time. Not the crooked setup he'd once used to make kitchen knives and plow tools, but a proper forge shaped by stone and time. He crafted weapons, yes, but not for war, for readiness, for the defense of what mattered, for the idea that strength without kindness was hollow, and every weapon bore the same mark, not a lion or a crown, but a single-stitched symbol burned into the hilt. Still here. It had become a code, a creed, a quiet answer to a world that still from time to time came clawing. Because peace, no matter how fiercely guarded, is never permanent. Trouble came again, as it always does. This time, it wore a different face. Not bandits, not soldiers, but men with papers, maps, and mouths full of gold-dipped promises. They came from the capital. The king, new, young, ambitious, had heard whispers of the hill, of the school, of the people who followed no crown but walked like legends, and he wanted it. They arrived with scrolls and signatures, saying the land was needed for expansion, saying a royal outpost would bring prosperity, saying it would honor the legacy of Sir Elric. Lysa listened, then she took them to the tree. This is his grave, she said, voice even, and his kingdom. The officials scoffed. The king offers more than soil and sentiment. He offers purpose. Lysa pointed to the students practicing quietly in the field beyond the garden. Young, old, every shape, every color, faces lined by hardship, eyes lit by hope. We already have purpose, she said. They tried to insist, to charm, to threaten. And then, one night, they tried something worse. A fire, set in the dead of dark, meant to scare, to shake resolve. It caught the edge of the forge, spread too fast, too hot. Embers floated like angry ghosts into the sky. But the village didn't scatter. They rose. Buckets flew. Hands formed lines. Lysa led the charge with a soaked cloak over her shoulders. Milo barreled through smoke to pull children from the flames. The students, trained in patience and chaos alike, held the line. By morning, the fire was out. The forge damaged, not destroyed. The officials gone. And nailed to the door of the cabin was a single note, scrawled bitter. We warned you. Lysa read it, folded it, burned it, then said nothing at all. Instead, she walked to the tree, sat beneath its shade, and let her fingers rest on the roots. You didn't fight with swords, she whispered. You fought with stillness. The others joined her. That night, the forge was rebuilt. The next week, the training doubled, and a new cloth was stitched, not to replace the old, but to continue it. A second banner, same words. You are still here. Because they were. The message spread, slowly, like moss, like wildfire with manners. More came, people from distant cities, from broken towns. Some came to train, some came to heal, some came to simply sit beneath the tree and breathe. The hilltop became more than a school, it became a signal that goodness does not disappear, that kindness can endure, that even in a world bent on forgetting, there will always be places that remember. Elric's name was never etched in stone in the capital. No statue stood in the palace courtyard, but in 1,000 whispered stories by firelight in taverns on long walks between broken villages, his name lived, the same 4 words. You are still here. Spoken, not just as comfort, but as truth. Because legacy is not what you leave behind. It's what you teach others to carry forward. And so they carried it, not in armor, but in action. Not in titles, but in truth. And on that hill, beneath that tree, a generation bloomed, not as soldiers, not as servants, but as stewards of the quiet fire that one man lit, and many refused to let die. Still here, still burning, still enough. It began again with footsteps. Not the heavy stomp of soldiers, not the quick, panicked pace of messengers. These were quieter, intentional, measured, and they came from the forest, through fog and pine, between moss-covered stones and forgotten paths. There were 3 of them. One wore a cloak too fine for traveling and boots too clean for climbing. Another, younger, kept his hand near the hilt of a sword he hadn't yet earned the right to carry. And the last, an older woman with sharp eyes and a worn satchel, said nothing at all. She was the one to stop first, to notice the garden, the forge, the tree. They had arrived. Lysa saw them from the ridge where she'd gone to clear her head. The fire had been rebuilt weeks ago, but the scent still lingered like a memory that refused to fully leave. She made her way down slowly, her cloak catching the breeze like a flag, though it bore no crest. Just stitches. Just where? The visitors were waiting by the well when she approached. The man with the fine cloak stepped forward, full of confidence that came from too much comfort. "You must be Lysa," he said. She nodded and said nothing. "We're here on behalf of the crown. A new delegation, not the fools who sent fire and threats." He smiled like that was enough to erase everything. "We're not here to take anything," he continued. "We're here to offer a place, a seat, recognition. We want what you've built to be part of something larger." Lysa raised an eyebrow. "You want to own it," she said plainly. He laughed a little too loud. No, just guide it. You have students, ideas, influence. The realm could use someone like you." Beside him, the younger man fidgeted. The older woman said nothing. Lysa turned and nodded toward the forge. "You see that boy over there? The one shaping the hilt?" They looked. "He came here after losing both parents that couldn't speak for weeks. Now he crafts blades steadier than most men swing them." She pointed again. "And that girl in the garden? She used to steal just to eat. Now she grows food for others." The man frowned. "I don't see how this—" "You don't need to," Lysa said. She stepped closer, her voice calm but sharp. "This place isn't about being seen. It's about seeing." The older woman finally spoke. "You were trained by Elric." "It wasn't a question." Lysa nodded. The woman reached into her satchel and pulled out something wrapped in oilcloth. She unfolded it with care, revealing a small carving, a horse, weathered, worn, familiar. "My father met him once," she said, "in the southern marshes. He never forgot." Lysa took the carving in both hands. Her throat tightened, but her voice remained steady. "He didn't leave statues," she said. "No," the woman agreed. "He left reminders." Silence settled over the group. Then softly, Lysa said, "Come." She led them past the forge, past the garden, past the schoolhouse where voices rose in laughter and learning. She brought them to the tree. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves like a whispered memory. Beneath the branches sat the bench and the plaque. "Sir Elric, Knight of Stillness, Builder of Roots, Keeper of Fire." The younger man stepped closer. "Is this where he—" Lysa nodded. The man removed his hand from his sword. The woman knelt and placed a hand on the earth. The one in the cloak just looked uncomfortable. "You've built something powerful here," he said again. "Yes," Lysa replied, "and we've kept it safe." He hesitated. "So you won't accept the king's offer?" She looked at him, then looked past him, to the students sparring in the clearing, to the fire being stoked for the evening meal, to the sky bleeding orange as dusk approached. "I already have," she said. Confused, he tilted his head. "What do you mean?" She smiled. "We accepted it the day we stayed." He didn't understand, but the others did. They left the next morning. No contracts signed, no banners were exchanged, just 3 sets of footsteps retreating into the trees and one carving left behind, resting now at the foot of the tree beside the cloth beneath the roots. The students kept training. The forge kept burning. The hill remained. And every year after that, on the anniversary of Elric's final breath, they gathered. Not to mourn, but to remember. They brought stories, old and new. They added stones to the base of the tree. They read aloud from the journal Lysa had begun keeping, a record of teachings, of names, of truths whispered in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn. One entry read, "Strength is not how loud you strike, it's how gently you carry what you cannot drop." Another, "Sometimes the bravest thing you'll ever do is not leave." And beneath them all, at the bottom of every page, stitched in ink the color of midnight, "You are still here." And so he was, in every sparring step, in every blade that is protected, not harmed, in every voice that rose in the stillness saying not, "I am Elric, but I remember him." And that was enough. The wind changed that autumn, not in the way that signaled seasons. Those changes were expected, welcomed. No, this shift was something else. It carried a different weight, a tension, a warning, though none could name it at first. It began with silence. Birdsong disappeared from the woods beyond the hill. Squirrels stopped raiding the garden. Even Mora, now moving slowly through her last years, kept closer to the cabin, ears twitching at shadows that didn't quite belong. Lysa noticed. She didn't say anything immediately, not to the students or Milo. But every morning she stood longer at the ridge, scanning the trees, listening, waiting. It wasn't long before the signs became harder to ignore. One night a messenger arrived. His horse was near collapse, his cloak torn, his hands shaking. He didn't ask for food or shelter. He asked for Lysa. "The capital's fractured," he said. "There's a new faction. They call themselves the Emberborn." Milo poured him water while Lysa crouched near the fire, the messenger's words flickering like a flame. "They're not interested in ruling," the boy continued. "They want to wipe it clean. Everything. History, tradition, symbols. They call it purification." Lysa said nothing. "They're burning schools," he added, voice barely more than breath. "Places like yours." That was all she needed. The next morning, she called an assembly. It wasn't dramatic. There was no bell, no alarm, just her voice, steady and calm. "We have prepared for many kinds of storms," she said, "but now one comes that doesn't just want to change the weather. It wants to erase the land." Students glanced at one another. Some gripped their training staff. Others held the edges of their tunics. "We will not meet it with rage," she continued. "We will not meet it with panic, but we will meet it." And that's exactly what they did. The hilltop became a fortress, not through stone or steel, but through unity. Milo and the blacksmiths reinforced the forge, turning it into a beacon of heat and resolve. Older students trained the younger, not in combat, but in awareness, how to see before striking, move like a shadow, and listen for what doesn't want to be heard. And Lysa went to the tree. She knelt beside it, her hand resting on the plaque. Then carefully, she buried the cloth again, deeper this time, wrapped in oilskin, protected. "You are still here," she whispered, and the wind answered. The Emberborn came at dawn. Their banners were red and black, their armor scorched and jagged. They did not shout. They marched. Clean lines, dead eyes. Men and women believed in fire the way others believed in gods. They stopped at the base of the hill. One stepped forward, tall, pale, with a voice like cracking wood. "You do not belong to the crown," he said. "You do not serve the flame. You are an infection. We are here to remove you." Lysa stepped forward. "We are not a weapon," she said. "You are a story," he replied, "and stories are dangerous." Behind her, the hill stood quiet, still, but not passive. "Then you will have to climb," she said. They did, and the hill did not surrender. Students moved like water, guided by years of practice, driven by the memory of what had come before. They did not fight to kill. They fought to stand, to delay. The Emberborn were fierce, trained, ruthless, but they lacked one thing. They had never learned to stay. The battle was not won in a blaze of glory. It was endured, held, lived. By sunset, the hill still stood. Blood had been spilled. The forge was scorched again. The tree had lost 2 limbs, but it was not broken. And at the base of it, where the earth had been disturbed, something soft peeked through the soil. A scrap of cloth. Lysa saw it, so did the man in red. He stepped forward, fury in his eyes. This place should have burned. It's already fireproof, Lysa replied. He raised his sword, and then he froze. Because every student, every teacher, every elder, every hand rose with a blade or tool or staff in defense, not of vengeance, of memory, of the choice to remain. He left, silently, but not because he was defeated, because he had nothing left to burn. That night, they rebuilt again, not because they were naive, but because that is what hope does. It doesn't erase ashes, it grows through them. The forge was reignited, the tree was tended, and the cloth was lifted from the soil, cleaned, and pinned back on the wall inside the cabin. Its edges frayed, its threads loose. But the words, still stitched, still true. You are still here. And as long as that was true, the fire would not go out. Not on that hill. Not in them. Not ever. The embers didn't fade. Not that night, and not in the nights that followed. They glowed in the forge, yes, but more than that, they glowed in the people. In their eyes, in their silence, in the way they moved through the aftermath, not with fear, but with reverence. The hill had not just survived, it had endured something meant to erase it. And that changes people. Lysa stood beneath the tree long after the others had returned to their work. The broken branches had been cleared, the roots, disturbed by fire and foot, had been gently covered again with soil and stone. But the tree still swayed like it remembered every footstep, every shout, every decision. You didn't fall, she said, fingers brushing the bark, and neither had she. But it wasn't over. Whispers came first, like smoke under a door. The Emberborn had not stopped. They had retreated, yes, but only to regroup. Their next target wasn't a village or a forge. It was the idea. The idea that something gentle could still be strong. That tradition could be rewritten, not with conquest, but with care. And so, Lysa did something she never thought she would. She sent out a call. Not a cry for help, not a plea for protection, but a question. To old students, to wandering swords, to forgotten knights and silent survivors. Do you still believe? The answers came not in letters, but in footsteps. They came from across the realm. A healer who had once stood in Elric's shadow, now older, scarred, and unshakable. A pair of siblings who had once trained in the rain with crooked sticks, now carrying real weapons, forged with purpose. A man who had fled battlefields for years, now returning not to fight, but to stand. They came not because Lysa asked them to, but because they couldn't not come. The hill swelled with voices, with hands, with memory. They rebuilt again, not because it had fallen, but because they wanted it stronger. Not just stone and timber, but the story, the place, the reason. And then one morning, as frost clung to the windows and breath puffed in white clouds, Milo placed something new in the center of the square. A monument. Not tall, not flashy, just a circle of stones. At the center, a fire pit, and above it, carved in the wooden ring that encircled the space, were words that needed no introduction. You are still here. Below it, a second line, added by Lysa, spoken aloud only once. And so are we. It became ritual. Every night they lit the fire, not for heat, not for light, but for remembrance. Stories were told there, some long, some barely more than whispers. No one was required to speak, but all were welcome. One evening, as the fire crackled and sparks drifted into a sky blooming with stars, a small boy tugged at Lysa's sleeve. Was he real? The boy asked. The knight? Lysa smiled. He was. What happened to him? He stayed. The boy thought about that, then asked, Is that why we're here? Lysa nodded. It's why we're still here. The boy sat quietly after that, legs crossed, eyes wide, listening to stories he didn't yet understand but already knew were true. That same night, a stranger arrived. Tall, hooded, moving like someone who had forgotten how to be noticed. They didn't ask for shelter, just stood at the edge of the firelight, listening. Lysa approached with a cup of cider. You came far, she said. The figure nodded. Removed the hood. A woman older than Lysa, with streaks of gray in her hair and hands that bore the marks of 1,000 miles walked. I was there, she said. When the capital fell, when the banners changed, I ran. No shame in that. I didn't run out of fear, the woman said. I ran because I didn't believe it could be better. And now, the woman looked around, at the students, the fire, the tree. Now I think I was wrong. Lysa handed her the cider. Then you're home. The woman stayed. So did others. And over time, the hilltop stopped being just a memory of Elric. It became a movement, not a rebellion, not a kingdom, a way of being. A belief that strength is not always loud and legacy is not always written in stone. It was written in steps taken, in tools shared, in beds offered to the weary, in kindness held long enough to feel like power. The Emberborn returned once more, but they didn't bring fire this time. They brought a representative, young, nervous, unarmed. He sat by the fire like everyone else, listened, then said, "We were wrong." No one cheered, but someone passed him bread, and that was enough. The cloth still hung in the cabin, framed now behind glass, protected from weather, but never from meaning. Every new student read it, every old friend whispered it, every night the fire burned under its echo. "You are still here." And in every voice that spoke after it, and so are we. The snow fell softer that year. Like the sky too had learned the art of stillness. It blanketed the hill in silence, muffling footsteps, catching on branches, resting gently on rooftops. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. Children bundled in wool slid down icy paths with shrieks of delight. And each night, as the fire in the circle blazed, they gathered. Not for warmth, but for story. Something had changed. The Emberborn, once a threat whispered about in corners, had fractured. The movement that came with flame had tried to erase the past, but found itself melted by the very thing it hated: memory and mercy. Their numbers had thinned, their purpose fractured by self-reflection, by doubt, by the quiet power of what they had tried to destroy. The stranger who had sat by the fire, he returned. Not once, but often. He didn't carry messages anymore. He carried lumber. He helped repair a wall near the forge. He planted herbs beside the schoolhouse, and when a child fell and scraped their knee, it was his hands that offered the bandage. The past, it seemed, had decided to stay and help build the future. Lysa watched all of this not from above, but among. She no longer walked with the careful tension of someone holding everything together. The weight hadn't disappeared, but she wasn't holding it alone anymore. There were new leaders now, new voices, but all spoke the same language: protect, preserve, prepare. And each one, before being trusted with responsibility, was brought before the cloth. The words hadn't faded, not in the fabric, not in the people. You are still here, and so was he. In the spring, something unexpected happened. A letter, handwritten, tidy, old ink, older signature, from a small border town far to the west. They'd built something, a school, they said, after hearing stories. Not a copy, but a branch. A place where silence was respected, where gentleness was trained into strength, where stay was still a vow and not a weakness. And they asked if someone could come to teach, to help, to listen. Lysa folded the letter slowly. She didn't speak for a long while. When she did, it was to Milo. "Do you remember what he said?" "Which time?" Milo asked, drying his hands. "The day he gave me the cloth." Milo nodded. "Don't be me, be better." Lysa exhaled. "Maybe it's time someone else stayed, and I go." She left in the spring. Not alone, never alone now, but with 3 students. One carried supplies, one carried stories, and one carried the new cloth stitched with a second line beneath the first. You are still here, and so are we. The journey took weeks, but when they arrived, the school was there. Small, unassuming, built of stone and sweat and faith, and filled with people who wanted not to conquer or claim, but to remember and build. Lysa didn't walk in with authority. She walked in with sleeves rolled up, a notebook in one pocket and the cloth in the other. They didn't know her face, but when she hung the cloth on the wall, someone whispered, "She's from the hill," and that was enough. Back home, on the ridge, Milo stood by the tree. It was blooming again, thick with blossoms, heavy with scent. A girl stood beside him, young, freckled, fierce. "Did she leave forever?" the girl asked. "No," Milo said. "She left for someone else's forever." The girl tilted her head. "Will I go too?" Milo smiled. "If the right question ever finds you, yes." She looked thoughtful, then nodded. "I want to be ready." "You already are." He handed her a small carving, newly finished. Not a horse this time, but a tree, its branches wrapping a small fire in the center. "What's this for?" she asked. "To remind you," he said, "that we don't spread by burning, we grow by planting." The girl held the carving tight as if it might float away. At the fire that night, the stories were different. They spoke of the first forge, of the raid that failed, of the stranger who stayed, of the cloth, the tree, the knight who never wore a crown but taught them how to bear weight like it mattered. They spoke of Elric, and then they spoke of Lysa, and someone asked, "What now?" And someone else answered, "Now we teach others what staying means." And in a dozen corners of the realm, across fields and forests, rivers and ruins, new stories lit like sparks, not loud, not fast, but steady. Because even after the night was gone, even after the students had grown, even after the fire was past, the words remained, "You are still here, and so are we," and so they were. There's something peculiar about the way fire travels. It doesn't always burn the same path twice. Sometimes it leaps, sometimes it smolders, sometimes it moves underground, quiet, unseen, until one day it bursts forth in a place no one expected. That was how the embers spread, not like an army, not like a revolution, but like a quiet flame that refused to die. Word of their rise swept through the realm, not with banners or drums, but with murmurs in markets, with carved signs left on doorsteps, with the scent of smoke where smoke shouldn't be. The old stories came alive again. Not polished versions sung in royal halls, but the rough, splintered truth passed from mouth to mouth about a knight who never wore armor, a hill that never surrendered, a fire that never went out. And in the north, near the black cliffs where the wind howled like a warning, something stirred. Not a kingdom. Not yet. A machine, a system. Cold, sharp, built by men who saw belief as an obstacle to control. They had watched the embers rise, at first amused, then irritated, then afraid. Because what do you do with people who do not kneel? What do you do with memory that refuses to die? You try to silence it. They sent envoys first, clean uniforms, clean threats. If you align with them, you'll burn. Many turned their heads, some folded, but not all. One ember, tucked in a valley so deep it never saw full daylight, stood their ground. Not with blades, but with roots, with a garden that grew despite frost, with children who stood hand in hand and stared back at the threat without blinking. The message they sent back was 3 words long. We remember Elric. And that was all it took. The machine responded the only way it knew how. Fire, steel, silence. The ember was raised, but not before a girl, 16, fast, carrying only a satchel and a carved figure of a tree, escaped into the mountains. She didn't know where to go. So she followed the stories. She ran by moonlight, slept in thickets, ate berries and root when no one would take her in. And weeks later she reached the edge of the map, an old hill marked with nothing, guarded by no gate. But when she arrived, someone was waiting. Milo. Older now, slower but unmistakable. He helped her down from the rocks, offered her water, a blanket, a seat by the fire. She didn't speak. Not at first. Not until she saw it. The cloth. Framed on the wall. Unfaded, she pointed. You know the words? I lived them, Milo said. Tears came then, not from weakness, but from finding at last something real. She stayed. She learned. And one day, as they watched the fire burn low and the sun stretch thin across the sky, she said, I want to go back. Why? Milo asked. Because they think we're scared. Milo smiled sadly. Aren't you? Every second, she said. But that's not the point. He nodded and helped her prepare. When she left, they gave her a new cloth, stitched by hand, lines steady, fire-colored thread woven into the edges. Not just to carry, to plant. She returned to her valley, not with an army, with seeds, with names, with the memory of a man who had never met her but had taught her everything. And there, in the ash, she built again. Not fast, not easy, but real. Other embers followed. The machine faltered because what it had failed to understand was this: flame is not what destroys, it's what remains. In time, the map filled with red dots, marks not of conquest, but of care. Not a kingdom, a constellation, each one burning because someone, somewhere, remembered. And the girl, her name was Alira, became something between a myth and a movement. She spoke softly, taught fiercely, and kept one carving always in her pocket, a tree wrapped in fire. She never claimed leadership, she claimed responsibility. And every night, before sleep, she would whisper the words her people had died for, the words her soul had grown around, the words stitched by hands she would never hold. You are still here, and so are we. And as long as that was true, the fire would never die. The world didn't pause for Elric's legacy. It spun onward, loud, messy, relentless. Kingdoms rose, alliances fractured, maps were redrawn by hands too quick to ink and too slow to understand. In the cities, nobles bickered over treaties while the streets filled with noise, coin, and the quiet ache of things forgotten too fast. But far from all that noise, on hills and in hollows, in forges and fields, something quieter bloomed. They called them embers. Not official, not titled, not even always named, just places, small ones, where people gathered around memory instead of thrones, where children learned not just how to wield a sword, but when to sheath it, where fire was not a tool of destruction, but of warmth, of light, of continuity, and every one of them, Every school, every shelter, every garden surrounded by silence traced itself back to one thing: the hill, the tree, the cloth. You are still here, and so are we. They became a kind of code, a quiet resistance, a reminder. Because even though the flames of the Emberborn had cooled, new dangers came. Always. Greed, power, forgetfulness, different names, same faces. And as new threats whispered at the borders, the Embers did not build armies. They taught. One of those places, far north, tucked between a frozen lake and a crooked pine grove, had grown in secret, led by an old man once known as a coward who had fled every battle until one day, years after his last escape, he found a carved wooden horse in a ruined chapel with those words scratched beneath it. He hadn't run since. That Ember became the first to face what history would later call the Second Quiet War. A silent occupation, one that moved not with flags or fanfare, but with laws, trade routes, and quiet disappearances. Villages erased from ledgers, people unremembered. They came for the Ember too. And when they arrived, demanding pledges and compliance, the old man, now no longer young but unbroken, stood in the snow and said, "We are not what you fear, we are what you forgot." Then he knelt and lit a fire, not for war, for witness. They tore it down, of course. But weeks later, word reached the hill. The Ember had fallen, but not quietly. Dozens had escaped, carrying books, letters, carvings, and one scrap of cloth. Milo held it in his hands. It was scorched along the edges, brittle in places, but the words were still there. Still stitched, still stubborn, still true. You are still here. He gathered the circle that night, not just students, but messengers, travelers, those who had returned from places where the soil no longer grew and the skies no longer cleared. We were never meant to last forever, Milo said, but we were always meant to pass it on. They listened, not as followers, but as carriers, and the decision was made, not by vote, not by order, but by shared breath. The Embers would not hide. They would rise, not as a force, but as a fire, small, steady, relentless, carrying not banners, but belief. One by one, the fires were relit in valleys, in ruins, in abandoned watchtowers and broken inns. People returned, brought wood, brought stories, brought silence, and each place where the fire was lit became another pulse, another breath in the body of something long thought extinguished. Lysa, far west now, received word by Carrier Hawk. She unfolded the parchment beneath a half-built shelter, surrounded by students too young to know what war truly meant. And when she read the words, just 5 of them, her hands trembled slightly. The Embers are rising again. She didn't cry, but she whispered thank you, because she had worried, quietly, in the spaces between lessons, that Elric's memory would be held only in stories, not in action, not in fire. Now she knew better. The cloth she carried was placed in a new frame, hung on a new wall, but not alone. Beneath it she placed a map, hand-drawn, incomplete, alive. Each ember marked with a single dot of red ink, and above it all she wrote, "Where there is memory, there is fire." The next week more arrived. A boy who had crossed 3 borders on foot, a healer who once treated kings and now treated those forgotten by them, a woman who had been born in a place where words like night were illegal to speak. They came because of stories. They stayed because of truth, and each night before the fire someone would recite it, not as prayer, but as promise. You are still here, and so are we. And in the glow of that fire, faces lit and shadows softened, the world didn't feel conquered. It felt claimed by kindness, by courage, by the quiet, enduring echo of a man who never asked for legend, only for the strength to stay, and whose greatest gift had not been a sword, but a sentence, passed down like a torch, burning still. Time, as always, kept moving. The map that once held only whispers and red ink had grown crowded. The embers, once sparks flickering against the dark, now dotted the realm like constellations. Some flourished in valleys, others clung to cliffs, snow-blown and wind-worn. A few burned quietly in the heart of old cities, disguised as bakeries, apothecaries, even taverns, but all of them, every last one, traced their roots back to that hill, that tree, that cloth. And now, the world began to notice. Not just tyrants, not just those who feared what couldn't be bought or broken, but ordinary people. Mothers who wanted safety without submission. Fathers who no longer believed silence meant strength. Children who had only known power as cruelty and now saw it woven in patience, in courage, in kindness that didn't flinch. The embers didn't ask for followers, they didn't demand tribute, but the people came anyway. They came with tools, with stories, with names of the lost. They came not to build monuments, but to build again what had been broken, buried, or long denied. And that, of course, could not last unnoticed. In the western reaches, a new power rose. They called themselves the Order of the First Flame. Their message was simple, dangerous, and eerily familiar. All fires must burn the same. They weren't the Emberborn, not exactly. They were colder, more organized, less rage, more precision. They wore white instead of red. They claimed peace, purity, unity, and under that banner they marched, quietly, systematically. The first ember they targeted was a farm. No weapons, just a well, a schoolhouse, and the phrase carved into the barn's beam, "You are still here." They burned it to the ground. The people barely escaped. Word reached Alira within days. She didn't wait. She gathered others, not soldiers, but stewards, people who remembered, who had built from ash and taught with scarred hands. They weren't trained in war. They were trained in staying. And this time they would not scatter. This time they would stand. The hill answered first. Milo, old as the roots beneath his feet, stood again at the ridge where he had once watched Lysa leave. Now he watched the wind. He wrote a letter. It read, "If they come, they will not find a school. They will find the fire, and this time it will not yield." The letter was sent, and the fire circle, once a place of stories and warmth, became something more. They dug deeper, reinforced the roots of the tree, not to hide, to anchor. The students trained, not for violence, for resolve. And when Alira arrived days later, hair wind-tangled, cloak torn at the sleeve, she didn't speak. She just placed a new cloth beside the old one, freshly stitched, edges red. "You are still here, and we will not leave." That night, they gathered in silence. The air was thick with waiting, and in the dark, the first torchlight appeared at the bottom of the hill. The order had come, but something strange happened. They did not charge. They did not shout. They stood, dozens of them, watching, measuring. A voice rose, calm, clear, from the lead rider. "You shelter dissidents," he called. "You teach rebellion." Milo stepped forward. "No," he said, voice cracked but sure. "We teach memory." The rider said nothing. The wind moved through the trees. "You have one chance to surrender," the voice continued. Milo looked at Alira. She said nothing, just nodded. Then he turned back. "No," he said again. "But you do." The rider laughed. "We are many." Milo pointed to the fire, to the students, to the hill behind them, lined with people not holding blades but holding ground. "So are we." The order moved at dawn, quick, clean, coordinated. But the hill didn't break. It bent, it flexed, it held. Every lesson Elric had taught, every whisper passed from Lysa's breath, every spark Alira had carried, came alive. The order was pushed back not by force alone, but by something older. Faith. Not blind, earned. When the dust settled, the hill still stood, the cloth still hung, and the fire still burned. They didn't cheer, they tended wounds, they buried no dead, because they hadn't lost anyone, only gained more. The order withdrew, not defeated, but confused, because no one had ever stood like that before. Without a king, without a god, just a cloth, a tree, and the words no army could kill. "You are still here, and we are not afraid." And from that moment, the world knew. This was no rebellion. This was remembrance, and it would outlast them all. Winter arrived heavier that year. It didn't creep. It descended, blanketing the hill with a weight that silenced even the boldest voices. Snow piled against the doors, draped over the fire circle like a shroud, and turned the air into something sharp enough to cut. The wind whistled through the trees like a warning from ghosts, and yet the fire never went out. Because this time, the fire was everywhere, not just in the pit, in the people. The order had retreated, yes, but the threat wasn't gone. It was changing, moving like smoke. No longer a frontal assault, but something quieter, more dangerous. Whispers in cities, infiltration in villages, false promises spoken with soft tongues and smiling teeth. They no longer came with swords, they came with doubt. And doubt, as Lysa had once warned, doesn't knock, it seeps. Alira sat by the forge, hands black with soot, a hammer resting across her knees. She stared at the flame, watched it dance and sputter. She'd heard the rumors, how some embers had dimmed, how some had chosen safety over truth, how some had even begun to question the cloth. "Maybe it's time to move on," one had said in a letter. "Maybe we've done enough." Alira hadn't answered, not because she had no words, but because words weren't what the world needed now. It needed presence. So she stayed. She taught every lesson herself that week, carved wooden tokens for the youngest children, cleaned the snow off every stone at the base of the tree with her bare hands. And each night before sleep, she whispered the vow again. You are still here, and so are we. Until one night, something broke. It wasn't loud, not a battle, not a shout, just the quiet sound of footsteps crunching in snow and a soft knock on the cabin door. Milo opened it. A boy stood there, young, shivering, coat too thin for the storm. In his hand, a piece of paper, wet, torn, but on it, in shaky ink, they took my ember. Elira took the boy inside, fed him, warmed him, asked no questions he wasn't ready to answer, but she knew. The order was not just retreating, it was hunting, snuffing out sparks in silence, one by one. She stood that night beneath the tree. Snow fell in thick flakes, clinging to her shoulders, her hair, her hands. Behind her, the hill slept. But in her chest, something ancient and iron stirred. The fire had been patient. Now it would move, not in rage, in return. The next morning, the plan began. Not a war, a pilgrimage. Elira would leave the hill, not to flee, but to remind. She would visit every ember that remained, touch every fire that still dared to burn. And with her, she would carry a new cloth, stitched not just by her, but by every hand on the hill. Each line embroidered by a different voice, each edge bound in thread soaked in ash from the first fire circle. It read, You are still here. We remember. We remain. The hill would stay safe, led by Milo and the next wave of leaders. Children no longer, hardened by truth, softened by memory. Elira left at first light. Mora's descendant, a mare with the same stubborn streak and smarter eyes, carried her through snow, through silence, through places where the wind had learned to whisper names. At the first ember, they lit the fire again. At the second, they found survivors hiding in the cellars, too afraid to speak until Elira showed them the cloth. By the fifth, something unexpected happened. People followed, not as soldiers, as stewards. One by one, the sparks lit until the map was no longer a map. It was a trail, a constellation, and the order, so sure in its precision, its method, began to falter. Because what it didn't understand was this. The embers didn't resist out of anger. They stood out of memory, out of choice, out of love. And love, when kindled long enough, burns without consuming. At the 20th ember, a child drew something in the dirt beside Elira's fire. A hill, a tree, a sword beneath it, and under the drawing, 3 words. Tell the others. She did. She kept moving, and each place she stopped, she left a small mark, a circle of stones, a branch wrapped in red thread, a single phrase carved into wood or stone or memory. Still here. By the time she reached the far south, where the sea met ruins and wind carved songs into cliffs, she stood at the edge of the world and saw light behind her. Fires, dozens, hundreds, a horizon of memory, and from that place she raised the cloth one final time into the sky. The wind took it, but the words didn't need to remain stitched. They were already alive. You are still here. We remember. We remain. And the fire answered, not in roar, but in return. They called it the Silent March. No one planned it. No council gathered to draft the idea. No hero stood on a rock to make the speech that lit the spark. It wasn't like that. It wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. It was just real. One morning, in the farthest western ember, a town so quiet it barely had a name, people began walking. First, it was a baker and her son, then a blacksmith with one arm, then a girl who'd never spoken a word in her life, but hummed like she knew every song that had ever been sung. They walked east, toward the hill, toward the tree, and along the way they were joined, not by soldiers, by farmers, healers, old men with walking sticks, children who carried cloth scraps, artists, shepherds, broken knights who once fled and now limped forward with the slow, heavy grace of those who finally understood why staying mattered. They said nothing, no chants, no slogans, just a steady, wordless march of presence. Because by now, the words didn't need saying. You are still here. We remember. We remain. Those who saw them tried to name them, tried to label it, a protest, a rebellion, a movement. But the truth was simpler. They were returning, and it shook the world more than any war. The Order of the First Flame tried to stop them. They blocked roads, closed borders, spread rumors of disease, of heresy, of spies among the embers. But it didn't work, because fire doesn't need permission to burn. At one checkpoint, a man stepped into the path of the marchers, shouting, "Where are you going?" An old woman with a cane stepped forward. Her voice cracked, but her eyes were steady. Back to the beginning. And they walked past him. One night, under a sky so clear it seemed carved from glass, Alira sat beside a small fire off the main road. The marchers camped nearby, scattered across the field like embers themselves, small lights glowing in the grass. She held the cloth in her hands, fingers tracing the thread worn smooth from so many stories, so many hands. Milo joined her, slower now, his breath fogging in the night. "They'll be at the hill in 3 days," he said. Alira nodded. "It's time," she said. "Not for war, for witness." Back on the hill, the tree still stood, its bark darker now, tougher, its roots twisted deeper into the earth, wrapping around memories, bones, seeds. The fire circle was ready. The cloths, dozens now, lined the cabin's walls. And every morning, a new mark was added to the map. Red dots, so many red dots, too many to count, too many to ignore. When the silent march finally reached the base of the hill, no trumpets sounded, no guards saluted. They simply arrived, thousands of them, filling the valley, lighting their own fires, telling their own stories. Not in shouts, but in whispers, in laughter, in the clatter of bowls and shared bread, in lullabies. The order sent a delegation. Clean boots, clean hands, too many rings on too many fingers. They asked for negotiations. Alira met them in the fire circle. Milo stood beside her. Lysa returned too, having traveled in secret for weeks, a ghost stepping back into the light. "You've created a threat," one delegate said. "We created a home," Lysa answered. "You inspire defiance. We inspire memory. You risk war." "No," Alira said. "We refuse to forget." The delegation left that night, and the world held its breath. What came next was unexpected. Nothing. No flames. No army. Instead, the order began to fracture from within. Whispers, defections, questions, because even those trained to forget couldn't ignore what they saw. Children reading by candlelight, old men repairing roofs, girls carving cloth into the earth with fingers black from ash, a tree surrounded by stone and silence, more sacred than any temple. And 3 words that had outlived kings: still here, still burning. Years passed. The embers did not disappear, they didn't conquer, they didn't collapse, they endured, they adapted. The silent march became the day of return, marked every year, not with parades, but with planting, with music, with one shared vow whispered into every hearth, every corner of every ember. You are still here. We remember. We remain. And somewhere, in the quietest part of the night where wind meets leaf and firelight dances low, the story continues. Not as a tale, as truth, as legacy, as something stitched so deep into the fabric of the world, it no longer needed to be written. It only needed to be lived. They said no fire lasts forever, but maybe they'd never met one that wasn't trying to destroy. Because the fire on the hill didn't rage. It didn't consume. It didn't demand. It waited. It welcomed, and more importantly, it taught. Years after the silent march carved its quiet place into the memory of the realm, the embers had stopped being questions. They were answers. Proof that gentleness could outlast fear, that roots could grow through ash, that memory wasn't weakness. It was armor, worn not on the chest, but in how a person chose to stand. On the hill, the tree now towered, gnarled, wide, marked with initials from 100 hands. Its canopy stretched like an umbrella of peace, casting shade over generations who had never known Elric, but knew what he left behind. Milo, older now than most remembered humans could get, sat beneath it each morning, wrapped in a thick shawl, a mug of cider in his hand, his cane leaning against the roots like an old friend. Every morning, students came. Some sat in silence, some asked questions, some just left offerings, stones, carvings, folded bits of parchment, scrawled with the words that had built the world they now stood in. You are still here. We remember. We remain. One morning, a boy, no older than 10, climbed up beside Milo and asked, "Do you think he knew?" "Knew what?" That it would last, that it would matter. Milo smiled, eyes rimmed with age, but burning still. "No," he said, "I think he just hoped." The world had changed. The order of the first flame had broken into fragments. Some dissolved quietly, others reformed into something gentler. A few wandered still, confused, unsure what to do with the fire they once tried to control. But they were no longer feared. They were remembered. And that was enough. The embers, on the other hand, had grown. Not into kingdoms, not into cities, but into a network of care. They built paths, not roads, not highways, just soft, well-worn trails connecting one ember to another. They called them veins. And when travelers walked them, they didn't ask for tolls, they asked for stories. Alira had walked nearly every one. She was older now, lines around her mouth, silver in her hair. She no longer carried the original cloth. That one stayed safe, encased behind glass in the schoolhouse beneath the hill. But she carried a copy stitched with her own hands, and every time someone new asked, "What does it mean?" she didn't answer. She simply pointed to the people beside her and let them tell it. One spring, as petals fell like confetti across the fire circle, a messenger arrived. Not with panic, not with warning, but with invitation. From across the sea, a new land, unfamiliar, curious. "We've heard of your hill," the letter read, "of the cloth, the stories, the staying. And then, would you come?" Alira didn't hesitate. She had grown up on paths, she didn't fear long journeys, and she knew the fire could not just stay, it had to be shared. She left the next morning, followed by a caravan of weavers, gardeners, and quiet warriors. Not an army, an offering. They sailed across gray water, into mist, into lands where her name was unknown, but the word ember rang like a bell in the mouths of those too tired to hope and too stubborn to stop trying. They built their first fire in a crater once called Cursed. They planted herbs where ash had ruined the ground. They taught not how to fight, but how to wait, how to rebuild without erasing, how to speak without shouting. And as more came, as the fires grew, Alira walked to the edge of the tallest ridge and wrote a new line beneath the words on her cloth. It read, "Even here." The embers now stretched across oceans. But they were still the same. They didn't publish doctrines. They didn't name leaders, they just burned. Brightly, quietly, everywhere. Back on the hill, Milo passed peacefully in his sleep beneath the tree. The students buried him there, next to Elric's stone, with nothing more than a wooden plaque that read, "He stayed," and beside it, carved deeply into the bark above the bench, they added, "We will too." At the next gathering, thousands returned, not to mourn, to honor, to remember, to promise again what had been promised before. That staying wasn't weakness, that memory wasn't a wound, that fire, real fire, the kind passed from soul to soul, was the only thing that truly endured. And as the stars blinked above the hill and the last voice fell quiet around the fire, one of the younger students stood and whispered, "He was right." "Who?" someone asked. "Elric," she said, "about what matters." And no one needed to ask what she meant, because everyone already knew. They were still here, and the fire had never once gone out. The hill was quieter now. Not empty, never that, but quieter. The kind of quiet that follows music, the kind that lets echoes settle into the soil. Birds still sang in the mornings, the forge still rang in the afternoons, and the fire circle still burned each night. But something had changed, not broken, not lost, just transformed. The tree stood taller than ever. Its branches stretched wide, offering shade and silence and something close to shelter. Beneath it, two stones rested, Elric's, worn smooth by time, and Milo's, newer, but already gathering moss as if the earth itself recognized his weight. Between them sat the bench. No one claimed it, but everyone sat there eventually. Lysa had returned, not as a warrior or leader, but as a visitor. She walked the hills slowly, greeting the newest students with a nod, stopping now and then to place her hand on the bark of the tree like one would a shoulder. She had taught for years, guided for decades. But now, like the fire, she had become something else, something steadier, something less about doing and more about being. The map in the schoolhouse had changed again. It now stretched across two walls. Red threads connected each ember, woven into the canvas like veins through a living body. Some were bold, others thin, but none were fraying. In the far north, where ice turned rivers to glass and the sun barely rose in winter, a new ember had begun, built into the side of a cliff warmed by geothermal springs. They carved their cloths into stone, knowing fabric wouldn't survive. But the words remained the same. You are still here. We remember. We remain. Even here. In the deep south, where sandstorms tore roofs from homes and swallowed entire roads, another ember bloomed beneath the dunes. They built underground, used clay tablets instead of parchment, but still passed on the oath each child swore not to a crown, but to the quiet. Stay when others flee. Speak when others forget. Burn without destroying. Back on the hill, a girl named Senna arrived with a letter sewn into the lining of her cloak. She had traveled alone, crossing borders where embers were still seen as danger, passing through towns that had forgotten what it meant to stand for something instead of someone. She found the hill at dusk, the sky bruised violet, smoke rising gently from the chimneys. Her feet bled, her voice was hoarse. But when she saw the fire circle, she wept, not from pain but from relief. She stayed, and 3 months later, she stood before the tree and read the letter aloud. It was my father's wish that I learn what it means to stay. He could not, but I can, I will. Lysa placed a hand on her shoulder. You already have. Senna became a weaver, not just of cloth, but of stories. She embroidered not just the old lines, but new ones passed down from children, farmers, students, from places even the map hadn't yet reached. And soon a fifth line was added beneath the others. It read, "Until the stars forget us." Some found it too poetic, others found it perfect. Either way, it stuck. In one ember built beside a waterfall that never froze, they sang the line into the mist each morning. In another, floating on wooden beams across a marsh, they painted it on the backs of turtles and let them drift. The world outside the embers continued, as it always had. Kings rose and fell, new wars flickered at borders, empires bickered over coins and names and pride. But the embers didn't fight for control. They didn't seek recognition, they just burned. And eventually, even the world had to notice. Not because of one moment, but because of all of them. Thousands of small, silent acts of remembrance. A healer who walked 2 days to treat a wounded stranger without ever asking their name. A boy who shielded a ruined book from the rain because it contained one story about Elric. A sculptor who rebuilt a toppled monument, not to a general, but to a cloth. And in time, the embers were no longer seen as relics or rebels. They were seen as roots. Stable, unshakable, necessary. And on the hill, under the tree that now housed birds who had never known war, the bench remained open. One evening, Senna sat there beside Lysa. The fire cracked, the stars blinked. What happens, Senna asked, when even we are gone? Lysa smiled. Not sadly, not with fear. When we're gone, the stories won't be. Senna looked at the map. At what point do stories become truth? They always were, Lysa said. We just had to stay long enough to prove it. And that night, as the fire circle filled with voices from across the world, no one stood to give a speech. No one claimed leadership. No one shouted. They just sat, together, silent, certain, because the fire was never meant to blind, only to warm, only to guide, only to remind that even when the world spins too fast, even when memory fades, even when power forgets, you are still here, we remember, we remain, even here, until the stars forget us. The wind changed again. It always does. Not the kind that brings storm or frost, but the kind that carries messages without words, the kind that moves through leaves with purpose, that rattles shutters, not out of rage, but to remind you that nothing, no matter how sacred, is immune to change. And on the hill, under the watchful limbs of the old tree, change had arrived. Senna was older now, not old like Milo had been, not yet. But her hair had grayed at the temples, her fingers had stiffened, and the weight she carried was no longer stitched into her cloak. It was stitched into her voice. Each word bore weight, not from volume, but from memory. She'd taken her place on the bench, though she never claimed it. The stories still passed through her hands, but fewer people were asking for them, because the world had begun to forget again. Not everywhere, not at once, but in small, dangerous ways. A merchant refused to trade with an ember because their coin bore no king. A school banned the story of Elric because it wasn't historically verified. In the South, a new movement whispered that staying was weakness, that memory was a trap, that fire was meant to burn, fast, loud, and final. And it rattled Senna more than she admitted. Because this time, the forgetting didn't come from enemies. It came from weariness, from children born into peace who never knew what it cost, from leaders who thought soft power meant no power at all, from the slow, creeping belief that maybe the world no longer needed reminders. One night after the fire had dwindled to coals, Senna walked alone to the tree. She touched the bark, scarred but alive. She looked at the stones, Elric's now nearly swallowed by moss, Milo's worn smooth, Lysa's recently placed, and then she sat and wrote. Not a story. A letter, addressed not to a person, but to the fire itself. It read, "You've lasted longer than any of us. You've crossed oceans, survived storms, been carried in hands too small to hold anything else. But if they forget you, if they stop whispering your name, it won't be because you failed. It will be because we did." She folded the letter and placed it in a jar, sealed it with wax, and buried it beneath the bench. The next morning, she called the circle. Old students, new ones, visitors, carriers. She didn't lecture. She didn't scold. She asked a question. "What does it mean to stay," she said, "if staying turns into hiding?" No one answered, so she stood and declared something none of them expected. "It's time," she said, "to carry the fire further, to leave the hill again, but not for war, for reminder, for invitation, so that those who had grown complacent might remember what it cost to be comfortable, so that the stories could be told by more than whispers, so that forgetting would no longer be a risk, because the fire hadn't been lit to be protected, it had been lit to be passed. And so, once more, they prepared, not as soldiers, as stewards. They created scrolls, each with the 5 lines translated into every language known. They packed cloths, stitched and dyed, burned at the edges, sealed with care. They carved tokens from the bark of the old tree, small enough to carry, strong enough to last. And they went, in pairs, in silence, to every place the embers had once been. To every place they'd never touched, to cities that didn't know the stories, to villages that had buried them. And at each stop they lit a single flame, left behind a token, spoke the vow, "You are still here. We remember, we remain, even here, until the stars forget us." Some laughed, some listened, some wept, but no one left unchanged. And back on the hill, Senna waited. Every evening she sat beneath the tree, waiting, listening, hoping, until one day a child arrived, wide-eyed, barefoot, carrying a folded piece of cloth, not stitched by Senna, not marked by the hill, but by someone else, from somewhere far. The cloth had only 3 words, "We heard you." And in that moment, the fire sparked brighter than it had in years, not because of how big it burned, but because of how far it reached. Because once again, they knew they were still here. The cloth was real. That was the first thing Senna noticed when the child handed it to her. It wasn't just a token, not some imitation of the old stories passed around like legend. The fabric was rough, woven by hand. The thread, crimson, slightly uneven, was pulled tight with care. It bore the marks of travel, soot, salt, a tear near the corner that had been stitched shut. And the words, "We heard you." They weren't stitched for beauty. They were stitched for survival. Senna stared at it for a long time, her weathered hands trembling just slightly. The child, silent but steady, didn't look away. They stood in the shadow of the great tree, the roots curling around Elric's stone like fingers too tired to let go. The fire behind them crackled softly. Dusk had begun to bleed into the sky, and somewhere deep inside her chest, Senna felt something shift. Hope, sharpened by urgency. She turned to the gathered circle that night, the cloth held high for all to see. "It's begun again," she said. No one asked what she meant. They knew. Because every time the world forgets, the fire must be reminded how to spread. And this time, it wouldn't wait. The next day, she called for the weavers, the gardeners, the storytellers. Not just the ones who had stayed, but the ones who had returned. Those who had once left to teach, to wander, to warn. They came back older, stronger, not to rest, to build, to begin again. Because the message, "We heard you," was more than response. It was signal. The cloth had come from the east, beyond the red crescent, beyond the fractured isles and the silver deserts, from lands the map still marked with phrases like unknown and unsettled. But someone there had heard, had listened, had believed, and that meant someone there needed more than memory. They needed fire. So the embers prepared, not for battle, but for invitation. They crafted a new set of scrolls, each bearing not the old oath, but a new one, meant for first hands, for those who had never heard Elric's name, never sat at the bench, never whispered beneath the tree. The new scroll read, "We are not what you were told. We are not what you fear. We do not seek power. We seek presence. And if you have ever lost something worth remembering, we are already with you." Senna chose 12, not for war, for witness. 12 messengers, 12 bearers, each with a cloth, each with a story. Each trained not to convince, but to remain, to listen, to let the fire take root where it could, even if only in a single heart. She didn't go herself. Her knees no longer trusted the roads, but she watched them leave. From the top of the hill where morning mist still curled like old secrets, she stood with the first light on her face and whispered the same words she had every time another left. "Return when you're ready, not when you're done." Weeks passed, then months. The tree bloomed early that year, its blossoms falling like soft embers across the circle. And then, one by one, the messengers returned. Not all of them, but enough. Some brought letters, folded, tear-stained, covered in soot or flower petals. Some brought carvings, new symbols, new scripts, but always the same meaning. Some returned with nothing at all but their silence, and that was enough too. Because every return was proof that staying had never been about standing still. It had been about carrying. One brought back a child, barefoot, wide-eyed, much like the one who had arrived months ago. But this one carried no cloth, just a single whispered phrase. I saw the fire in someone's eyes. That night, they carved a new phrase into the ring around the fire circle, not to replace the old ones, but to complete them. It read, "And now you carry it too." It was quiet, but it spread, not just in the embers, but beyond them, in city walls painted by children's hands, in taverns where travelers sang the fifth line softly beneath their breath, in prisons where the falsely condemned scratched the 4 words into the stone beside their beds. You are still here. And across the realm, wherever a fire was lit in silence, wherever someone stayed when leaving would have been easier, wherever someone remembered not for glory, but for love, they were part of it, even if they didn't know. Even if they never said the name Elric, they were part of the fire, and the fire, this time, would not flicker out, because when the world changes again, and it will, there will be someone on a distant road with thread in their pocket, cloth in their satchel, and a vow on their lips. Not to fight, but to remind, to pass the flame to the next soul who needs it most. And when they do, they will say the only words that ever mattered: you are still here. We remember. We remain. Even here, until the stars forget us, and now you carry it too. It started with a storm, not the kind you see brewing across the horizon, heavy and obvious, full of thunder and menace. No, this one came in pieces. A rumor here, a silence there, trade routes that slowed without warning, letters that never reached their destination, whispers that the world outside the embers had begun to spin too fast again. By the time the skies truly darkened, those who remembered knew something was coming. Senna watched it unfold from the hill. She had grown slower, yes, but not dull. Her mind was still sharp, honed by years of remembering what others forgot. She stood at the ridgeline where Milo once watched for riders and saw not soldiers but shadows, movements in the distance, patterns in the wind. And one night, a single rider approached the fire circle. They carried no flag, no threat, just a bundle, a wrapped cloth. When Senna opened it, she found something old and something new. A carved figure of a tree, its roots tangled around fire, and a scrap of paper with 6 words they are trying to erase again. No signature, no location. But that was enough, because the fire, once again, was being tested. This time it wasn't swords or flames, it was erosion. Soft, subtle, careful forgetfulness. Libraries being reorganized, monuments relocated, stories corrected, rewritten, diluted. They weren't burning books, they were burying them under prettier ones. And to those who'd never had to fight to remember, it felt harmless. But Senna knew better. Erasure isn't silence, she told the circle that night. It's replacement, and it always starts slow. So the embers acted, but not with fire, with presence. They called it the Ash Walk, a journey, not to spread or warn, but to witness. Ember keepers, young and old, left in pairs to visit every place on the map, every old ember, every thread on the wall, not to rebuild, not even to protect, to make sure they still existed, to sit at the roots of broken trees, to speak aloud the names carved into forgotten stones, to remind even abandoned soil, you were once important. Senna stayed behind, the fire her anchor, but her letters traveled with the walkers. Each carried a piece of her story, each carried her hope, and each returned with more than they'd left with, because even in places that had been covered up, paved over, repainted, something still remained. In a village turned mining town, a boy found a stone in the well, etched with 4 weathered words. You are still here. In a coastal city where ember had become rumor, a widow remembered the tune her father once hummed as he carved tokens late into the night. She didn't remember the story, but she remembered how it made her feel. And sometimes, that was enough. Still, the storm thickened. The forgetting grew bolder. A new order had risen, one not with iron fists, but velvet gloves. They didn't threaten the embers. They simply offered them a place in the new archive, a safe place, a sanctioned place, a way to remember, selectively. Some were tempted. Why not make the stories easier, cleaner, more appealing? Why not leave behind the hard truths, the grief, the failure, the wounds? Senna responded not with defiance, but with a new teaching, A memory edited is a memory ended. The embers held firm because they had not survived to be rewritten. They had survived to be retold, and so in the face of gentle erasure, they lit more fires, small ones, in cracks and corners, in the hearts of cities, behind bakeries, under libraries, in alleyways and quiet cafes. They left tokens in planters, cloth beneath floorboards, letters hidden in children's books, not to make war, to make weight, because the storm could take the obvious, but it could not take what was carried. And as the Ashwalkers returned, scarred, tired, hopeful, they brought with them something sacred, proof that the fire was not a chapter. It was a cycle, and like all cycles, it would turn again. But this time, they would be ready. They would not wait for someone to start the remembering. They would never stop. One night, as lightning crawled across the horizon like a warning scratched into the sky, Senna walked to the bench. Her legs ached. Her breath came slow, but she sat, hands folded, eyes clear. The newest students gathered, unsure if she would speak. She looked at them, all flame and future, and whispered, "They will try again." And then after a beat, "But we are still here." A child, barely old enough to walk, reached out and touched the hem of Senna's cloak. "Me too," she said, and the fire cracked like applause. Because in that moment, with the storm at the edge of the world and the cloth stitched into the sky by stars too stubborn to blink, everyone knew the truth. You are still here. We remember. We remain, even here, until the stars forget us, and now you carry it too, and carry it they did. The storm broke at dawn. It wasn't loud. There were no drums, no marching banners, no sudden clash of steel against stone. But the change in the air was unmistakable, like the sky itself had exhaled after holding its breath for too long. The clouds, long and low over the hill, began to peel away in silence, revealing a thin sliver of light stretching across the fire circle. And beneath the tree, Senna did not move. She had passed quietly in the night, her hands folded over her chest, her cloak still warm from where the fire had burned low. No cry of alarm had gone out, no panic stirred, because everyone who had known her understood this too was part of the vow, to stay until staying turned into becoming. And so they gathered, not to mourn, but to witness. They wrapped her in the first cloth she'd ever stitched, the one she'd carried through her youth, through her travels, through her fire-lit nights under the open sky. And on that cloth, the words were still there, faded but fierce. You are still here. We remember. We remain, even here, until the stars forget us, and now you carry it too. They laid her beside the others, Elric, Milo, Lysa, under the thickest root of the tree that now towered over the fire circle like an ancient guardian. And as the earth was pressed around her, the students didn't cry. They sang. It wasn't a song anyone had written, just a weaving of whispers, of shared breaths, of words passed down so many times they had no author. Just purpose. Later that day, a council formed, not by vote, but by quiet agreement, not to replace Senna, but to continue her work, to adapt. Because while the fire had survived blade and betrayal, what threatened it now was subtler. A new council had risen in the capital, clean, diplomatic, progressive, they called themselves. They wore no armor, raised no banners, but their policies were sharp as knives. A reformation of memory, they said, a new educational charter, one that aligned with the future. And in that future, there was no room for romanticized mythology like the embers. The fire circles, dangerous gatherings. The cloths, relics of superstition. The oaths, outdated. No one came to burn the hill. They didn't need to. They came with papers, not torches, with bureaucrats instead of soldiers. And they smiled as they tried to sign away what couldn't be taken. But they'd made a mistake. Because while the embers had changed the world quietly, they had not stayed silent. The Ashwalkers were still out there. The constellations of cloth still hung in corners and caves and classrooms where teachers whispered history under the sound of bells. The fire had already moved beyond the map. So when the emissaries arrived, polite and smiling, to request a graceful retirement of the hill, they were met not with argument, but with stories. The students sat them down, served them soup, and spoke, not in protest, but in lineage. They told of Elric's silence, Milo's roots, Lysa's stillness, Senna's echo. They told of nights spent under stars that did not forget, of cloth stitched with names and loss and joy and soil. They spoke for hours, and the emissaries, trained to dismiss, to delegate, found themselves listening. Because fire does not need to shout to burn. When they left, they took no signatures, only a single cloth, gifted by the youngest student. On it were the words, "You didn't take it, we gave it, so you'd remember." That cloth ended up in a museum, labeled anonymous, misunderstood, but it didn't matter, because even as governments shifted and policies rose and fell, the embers were no longer waiting to be recognized. They had already been received. The East held a new school carved into the cliffs of a canyon, only accessible by rope and song. The North now had floating ember boats, drifting village fires that moved with the tide, holding classes in their bellies and rituals on their decks. In the broken city ruins once called Vire, a young man had turned a gutted cathedral into an ember sanctuary, lighting candles in every broken window, each flame a name. And back on the hill, under the now sacred tree, a new figure sat on the bench. A girl with ink-stained fingers and a voice like slow thunder. She didn't call herself leader. She called herself flamekeeper, because that's all any of them were now. Carriers, not of power, but of presence. One evening, she stood before the fire circle, surrounded by new students, some fresh-faced, others worn by roads and regrets, and she said, "This is not where it ends. This is where it echoes." Then she unrolled a new cloth and read the words stitched there by dozens of hands. "You are still here. We remember. We remain. Even here. Until the stars forget us. And now you carry it too, so echo it." And they did. Across mountains, through markets, in alleyways and across oceans, they carried the fire, they echoed the vow, and the world, no matter how often it forgot, could never quite silence that sound again. It didn't spread like wildfire, it moved like breath, steady, unseen, in and out of mouths across the world until the words weren't just repeated, they were known, carried, embedded in rhythm, in ritual, in roots. The seventh line had changed everything. Start louder. It was a challenge, yes, but more than that, it release. A signal to stop whispering in corners and start engraving the truth on walls, on hearts, on the very bones of the earth. It was permission, after so many generations of careful survival, to stop hiding and begin ringing. And ring it did. The oath became drumbeat, then song. Children in steel cities skipped rope to its cadence. Miners in underground settlements carved the words into support beams with worn blades. Data streamers uploaded loops of the lines set against firelight, rainstorms, the distant hush of ocean tide, and millions watched, wept, reshared. The embers didn't just reawaken, they ignited. But with ignition came resistance. Not the old kind, not from kings or knights or frightened empires. This time it came from apathy, from noise. For every story lit with care, 1,000 distractions competed. For every cloth stitched with truth, 1,000 screens flickered with polished lies. And so the newest generation of flamekeepers changed tactics. They met the noise with presence. No debates, just showing up. They built quiet rooms, in transit hubs, small circles with flame simulators and the oath projected in soft golden letters. They offered memory not as defiance, but as refuge, a way to breathe again. And people did. Some stayed minutes, others hours, but each left with something, ashes on their sleeve, tears on their cheek, or often a cloth pressed to their palm, and the oath stitched inside, 7 lines, now spoken in over 93 dialects. Every translation careful, precise, because the words were sacred not in their sound, but in their meaning. And still, on the hill, the tree grew. It had weathered everything, ice storms, drought, fire, forgetting. And now it bore fruit, actual fruit. Small, glowing pods that ripened beneath its bark. No one had planted them. They were the tree's gift, nature's vow, that roots, tended long enough, would return something sweet. Visitors came just to touch its bark, to sit in its shade, to dream. One young girl, blind from birth, leaned her head against the tree and said she could hear it humming, a deep vibration like the ground remembering. She would become the next flamekeeper, the first to take the title before adulthood. Her name was Kale. She didn't speak often, but when she did, people listened. Because Kale had a way of making silence feel like truth. At her first gathering, she stood before the fire circle and did not speak the oath. Instead, she closed her eyes and sang the melody of it. No words, just tone. And every person present, no matter how far they had traveled, no matter what tongue they spoke, understood. The echo had become song, and it was louder than ever. But louder didn't mean careless. Kale taught them to wield memory like light, bright enough to guide, never to blind. And with her, the embers entered a new age, one not of survival, but of legacy. They no longer worried about being erased. Because even if the map burned again, even if the skies darkened, the tree would remain. The roots would remain. The cloth, copied, carried, etched into time, would remain. And in one final act of remembrance, Kale and her fellow flamekeepers traveled back to the beginning. Not just the hill, but the orchard. The place where Elric had once played as a child, sword made of stick, dreams too large for his village. They found it. Barely a grove now, just 5 trees, one leaning. But beneath the soil, they uncovered something impossible. A stone, flat, carved, untouched by erosion. And on it, one line. The line Elric must have written before all of it began. Let this be enough. Kale pressed her hand to it and smiled, because it had been more than enough. They left the orchard untouched, marked only with a circle of stones like the fire circle back home. No guards, no plaque, just presence, just invitation. And as Kale knelt beside that first seed of everything, she whispered, "You are still here." And behind her, 1,000 voices echoed, "We remember, we remain. Even here, until the stars forget us, and now you carry it too. Start louder," and so they did, and so it burned. Forever. It started with a storm. Not the kind you see brewing across the horizon, heavy and obvious, full of thunder and menace. No, this one came in pieces. A rumor here, a silence there. Trade routes that slowed without warning. Letters that never reached their destination. Whispers that the world outside the embers had begun to spin too fast again. By the time the skies truly darkened, those who remembered knew something was coming. Senna watched it unfold from the hill. She had grown slower, yes, but not dull. Her mind was still sharp, honed by years of remembering what others forgot. She stood at the ridgeline where Milo once watched for riders and saw not soldiers, but shadows, movements in the distance, patterns in the wind. And one night, a single rider approached the fire circle. They carried no flag, no threat, just a bundle, a wrapped cloth. When Senna opened it, she found something old and something new. A carved figure of a tree, its roots tangled around fire. And a scrap of paper with 6 words they are trying to erase again. No signature, no location, but because the fire, once again, was being tested. This time it wasn't swords or flames, it was erosion. Soft, subtle, careful forgetfulness. Libraries being reorganized, monuments relocated, stories corrected, rewritten, diluted. They weren't burning books, they were burying them under prettier ones. And to those who never had to fight to remember, it felt harmless. But Senna knew better. Erasure isn't silence, she told the circle that night. It's replacement, and it always starts slow. So the embers acted, but not with fire, with presence. They called it the Ash Walk, a journey not to spread or warn, but to witness. Ember keepers, young and old, left in pairs to visit every place on the map, every old ember, every thread on the wall, not to rebuild, not even to protect, to make sure they still existed, to sit at the roots of broken trees, to speak aloud the names carved into forgotten stones, to remind even abandoned soil, you were once important. Senna stayed behind, the fire her anchor. But her letters traveled with the walkers. Each carried a piece of her story. Each carried her hope. And each returned with more than they'd left with. Because even in places that had been covered up, paved over, repainted, something still remained. In a village turned mining town, a boy found a stone in the well etched with 4 weathered words. You are still here. In a coastal city where Ember had become rumor, a widow remembered the tune her father once hummed as he carved tokens late into the night. She didn't remember the story, but she remembered how it made her feel, and sometimes that was enough. Still, the storm thickened. The forgetting grew bolder. A new order had risen, one not with iron fists, but velvet gloves. They didn't threaten the Embers. They simply offered them a place in the new archive. A safe place, a sanctioned place, a way to remember, selectively. Some were tempted. Why not make the stories easier, cleaner, more appealing? Why not leave behind the hard truths, the grief, the failure, the wounds? Senna responded not with defiance, but with a new teaching. A memory edited is a memory ended. The Embers held firm because they had not survived to be rewritten. They had survived to be retold. And so, in the face of gentle erasure, they lit more fires. Small ones, in cracks and corners, in the hearts of cities, behind bakeries, under libraries, in alleyways and quiet cafes. They left tokens in planters, cloth beneath floorboards, letters hidden in children's books, not to make war, to make weight, because the storm could take the obvious, but it could not take what was carried. And as the Ashwalkers returned, scarred, tired, hopeful, they brought with them something sacred: proof that the fire was not a chapter, it was a cycle. And like all cycles, it would turn again. But this time, they would be ready. They would not wait for someone to start the remembering. They would never stop. One night, as lightning crawled across the horizon like a warning scratched into the sky, Senna walked to the bench. Her legs ached, her breath came slow, but she sat, hands folded, eyes clear. The newest students gathered, unsure if she would speak. She looked at them, all flame and future, and whispered, "They will try again." And then, after a beat, "But we are still here." A child, barely old enough to walk, reached out and touched the hem of Senna's cloak. "Me too," she said, and the fire cracked like applause. Because in that moment, with the storm at the edge of the world and the cloth stitched into the sky by stars too stubborn to blink, everyone knew the truth. You are still here. We remember. We remain, even here, until the stars forget us, and now you carry it too, and carry it they did. If this story lit even the smallest spark inside you, tell us. In the comments below, let us know. Where are you listening from? What line stayed with you? Was there a moment that made you stop, just for a second, and breathe a little slower? Your voice matters. Every comment is another ember in our fire circle. And when we read them, we remember this isn't just a story. It's a shared memory, a map we're drawing together, one quiet heartbeat at a time. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It's not just about numbers, it's about staying, about choosing to return night after night for the next story, the next spark, the next reminder that you're not alone. Until then, rest easy. The fire's still burning. We'll keep it warm for you. See you in the next chapter.